Welcome to Forgotten Slumber, the channel where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we journey into a world of shadows, fear, and ritual, the world of medieval public executions. Imagine cobblestone streets lined with anxious townsfolk, the air heavy with smoke and anticipation as the gallows and scaffold stand tall in the town square. Here, law, faith, and morality intertwined in a deadly dance. Across centuries, executions were more than punishment. They were lessons, spectacles, and social theater. Every swing of the axe, every drop of the rope, every flicker of flame carried meaning, shaping society and morality in ways that would echo long after the torches burned out. From petty thieves to heretics, rebels to accused witches, their stories reveal a world where justice was public, brutal, and unforgettable. Tonight, as you relax, let the weight of history settle around you. Listen to the echoes of the crowd, the solemn tolling of bells, and the whispers of the condemned. Each chapter of this documentary will guide you gently through fear, courage, and the rituals of medieval LAWS. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the past lull you into sleep. And remember, if you want more tales from the shadows of history, subscribe to Forgotten Slumber and hit the bell icon, because history has a story for every dream. Chapter 1: A Stage of Shadows. The role of public execution in medieval society. The Middle Ages were a time of contrasts. Castles rose against the horizon, markets bustled with trade, and cathedrals reached toward heaven with spires of stone. Yet beneath this vision of grandeur and piety, the medieval world carried with it an undercurrent of violence, fear, and control. Few symbols captured this duality more vividly than the public execution. For centuries, the act of taking a life was not hidden away behind prison walls or in private courts. Instead, it was placed at the very center of society, turned into a stage where justice, morality, and power were displayed for all to see. Imagine the town square on the morning of an execution. The air, usually filled with the chatter of merchants and the sound of livestock, hummed instead with anticipation. Crowds gathered, pressing shoulder to shoulder, from the lowest peasant to the wealthiest townsman. Children clung to their mothers, while elders leaned on their staffs, determined not to miss the spectacle. It was more than punishment. It was theater. It was ritual. It was a grim lesson that life, liberty, and loyalty were fragile things, easily broken by crime, sin, or treachery. To understand why public execution became so deeply embedded in medieval life, one must first look at the nature of medieval justice itself. Law in these times was not a cold system of statutes and codes, but a living force shaped by custom, faith, and hierarchy. A crime was not merely an offense against an individual. It was a disruption of the social fabric, a challenge to divine order, and a threat to the authority of king, lord, or church. To restore balance, punishment had to be visible. Justice had to be seen to be believed. Public execution was the ultimate performance of power. It reminded the people who ruled, who judged, and who had the authority to decide matters of life and death. The king's justice, carried out before his subjects, was both terrifying and reassuring. For the innocent, it was proof that law and order still stood firm against chaos. For the guilty, or those who feared becoming so, it was a warning carved in blood and fire. Methods of execution varied, each chosen not only for its lethality, but for its symbolism. Hanging, the most common, represented the stripping away of dignity and the finality of justice. Beheading, reserved for nobles or those of higher status, offered a cleaner and quicker death, though it was no less shocking for the gathered crowd. Burning at the stake, particularly for heretics and witches, carried a spiritual weight, turning punishment into purification by flame. Other methods, breaking on the wheel, drowning, drawing, and quartering, were not only punishments but spectacles of suffering, designed to echo in memory long after the event. But executions were not only about punishment. They were also about participation. The crowd was not merely an audience. It was part of the ritual. Their presence validated the act, transforming it from simple killing into a communal reaffirmation of order. Cheers, jeers, prayers, and gasps rose together, binding the community in shared experience. Even children, though horrified, absorbed the lesson. Crime brought consequences, sin invited suffering, and obedience preserved safety. Executions also held a spiritual dimension. In a world deeply shaped by the church, the condemned was often given the chance to confess and repent before death. Priests walked alongside the prisoner, urging them to seek forgiveness, assuring the crowd that the soul, however stained by sin, might still find salvation. This blending of fear and faith reinforced the idea that law and religion were inseparable, each supporting the other in the maintenance of order. Yet, beneath the solemnity and ritual, there was also a darker undercurrent. For some, executions were a form of entertainment. Vendors sold food and drink, jesters told jokes, and the day became something between a festival and a warning. The suffering of the condemned was a spectacle that drew crowds as much for curiosity as for moral instruction. This mixture of justice, theater, and bloodshed revealed both the fragility and the brutality of medieval society. Public executions were not limited to criminals of low birth. Rebels, traitors, and even nobles who fell from favor might find themselves before the crowd. These events carried political weight, sending clear messages to rivals, dissenters, and would-be conspirators. A beheading on the scaffold could silence whispers of rebellion more effectively than any decree. Fire and gallows could remind subjects that even the mighty were not safe from the laws, chilling as they were. These executions became part of the rhythm of medieval life. They were inscribed into memory, retold in stories, and recorded in chronicles. For some, they were warnings. For others, they were justice. For all, they were a reminder of the delicate balance between order and chaos, power and submission, life and death. In the chapters to come, we will explore the many forms this grim theater took: the gallows that loomed at the edges of towns, the flames that devoured heretics, the sword that flashed in the sunlight as noble heads rolled. We will uncover not only the methods but the meanings, the fears, and the beliefs that transformed execution from mere punishment into one of the defining rituals of the Middle Ages. For now, let us step into the square once more, feel the weight of the crowd pressing in, hear the distant toll of the church bell, and sense the silence that falls as the condemned is brought forth. Here, in this moment of dread and spectacle, we find the heart of medieval justice: public, brutal, and unforgettable. Chapter 2. The Gallows, hanging as a symbol of justice. The image of the gallows is one of the most enduring and chilling symbols of the Middle Ages. A simple wooden frame, two upright beams, and a crossbar, standing tall on a hill or at the edge of a marketplace. It was both a tool of death and a monument of power. Hanging was, without doubt, the most common form of execution throughout medieval Europe. It was simple to perform, easy to repeat, and highly visible to the crowd. Yet behind its stark efficiency lay layers of symbolism, ritual, and meaning that shaped not only the fate of the condemned, but the collective imagination of entire communities in a world where law was fragile and survival precarious. The gallows served as a constant reminder of the price of disobedience. Every village knew its place of execution. Sometimes it was a lone gibbet standing along a well-traveled road, where the bodies of criminals swayed in the wind as warnings to passers-by. Other times, it was a great wooden scaffold erected in the town square, to be dismantled and rebuilt as needed. In both forms, the gallows were not only instruments of punishment, but also statements of authority. They declared that the law was not merely words written in dusty charters. It was alive, sharp, and unrelenting. The ritual of hanging began long before the rope tightened around the condemned. First came the trial, often brief and brutal. Evidence might consist of testimony, rumor, or forced confession. Yet once judgment was pronounced, the path to the gallows was nearly inevitable. The condemned might be kept in a dungeon or in the stocks, exposed to the jeers of their neighbors, before being paraded through the streets to the place of execution. The procession itself was part of the punishment, a slow walk of shame, where the community bore witness to the fall of one of its own. The scaffold was usually surrounded by crowds. Men, women, and even children gathered, some out of curiosity, others out of grim duty, and many out of a desire to see justice carried out. Vendors might sell food or drinks nearby, for executions often became public spectacles that lasted hours. Priests would walk alongside the condemned, urging repentance and prayer. The ritual was both sacred and profane, a mingling of law, faith, and spectacle designed to etch the lesson into the hearts of all who watched. When the moment came, the condemned was often given the chance to speak. This final address was not only a personal farewell, but also a moral drama. The guilty might confess, apologize, or warn others not to follow their path. In some cases, they defiantly proclaimed their innocence or cursed their accusers. Whatever words were spoken, they carried weight, echoing across the hushed crowd before the silence was broken by the final act. The rope itself was more than a tool, it was a symbol. Its rough fibers, looped into a noose, represented both justice and inevitability. To place it around a man's neck was to bind him not just to death, but to the authority of the law. Some traditions gave the rope almost mystical qualities. Pieces of nooses were sometimes taken as charms, believed to carry power. This eerie practice reflected the deep superstition of the age, where even instruments of death could hold meaning beyond their grim purpose. The mechanics of hanging varied. In the early medieval period, the condemned might simply be placed on a ladder or cart, which was then pulled away, leaving them to strangle slowly. Death was not quick or merciful. It could take minutes, sometimes longer, as the body writhed and gasped. Later innovations included the drop, which snapped the neck more swiftly, though this was not widely adopted until later centuries. For most of the Middle Ages, hanging was a drawn-out, public struggle between life and death, designed to imprint itself on the memory of all who saw it. After death, the body itself became part of the spectacle. Sometimes it was cut down quickly and buried in unhallowed ground, far from the churchyard. Other times, the corpse was left to hang for days, its slow decay a lingering reminder of the law's power. In especially notorious cases, the body might be displayed in an iron cage or gibbet, suspended on a high hill or along a busy road. Travelers would see it swaying in the wind, a grotesque sentinel of justice. The message was clear. Crime had consequences, and the law never slept. Hanging was not only a punishment for theft or murder, it also carried symbolic weight in cases of treason and rebellion. To hang a traitor was to humiliate them, to strip them of honor, and to show that their defiance against authority had led them to the lowest possible fate. Nobles and knights, who might otherwise receive the more honorable beheading, feared the gallows above all. It was seen as a base, ignoble death, one that stained the memory of the condemned and their family. In this way, hanging was more than a physical end. It was a social annihilation. The gallows also became part of folklore and imagination. Ballads and stories spoke of highwaymen dangling in the wind, of lovers cut down from the noose, of spectral figures haunting the places where justice had been carried out. These tales blurred the line between history and myth, embedding the gallows deep into the cultural memory of medieval Europe. Children were warned of the scaffold if they disobeyed. Travelers prayed for protection when passing a gibbet at night. The very silhouette of the gallows became a symbol of fear and authority, etched into the collective mind. Executioners, too, played their part in this ritual. Though stigmatized and often shunned by society, they were essential figures in the machinery of justice. Their task was to tie the knots, to push the ladder, to ensure the sentence was carried out. Some gained reputations for their skill, either in bringing a swift end or in prolonging the suffering, depending on the demands of the law. They were both feared and necessary, living on the margins yet central to the drama of the scaffold. Yet amid all this darkness, the gallows also carried a strange sense of order. In a society where crime could tear apart fragile communities, where famine, plague, and war threatened daily existence, the gallows offered certainty. Justice, however harsh, was visible. It was not hidden in courts or prisons, but enacted before the eyes of all. It reassured the innocent that the law protected them, even as it terrified the guilty with its inevitability. The gallows, in all its stark brutality, was both a punishment and a performance of stability. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the gallows was its silence after the crowd dispersed. When the shouting faded, when the executioner packed away his tools, when the priest returned to his chapel, the scaffold remained. Empty, stark, waiting. The mere presence of the gallows, even unused, was enough to shape behavior. It was a shadow cast over the town, a reminder that the law was not distant but ever present, ready to claim its next victim in the end. Hanging in the Middle Ages was never just about killing. It was about authority, memory, and fear. It was about binding the individual to the community, forcing every person to witness the consequences of defiance. And in its wooden frame, in its rough ropes and swaying corpses, it carried a message that transcended death itself, that justice was public, unrelenting, and inescapable. Chapter 3. The Noble Death, Beheadings, and the Sword of Justice. Among the many methods of execution in the Middle Ages, none carried as much weight of honor and symbolism as beheading. Where hanging was the fate of thieves, outlaws, and commoners, beheading was often reserved for nobles, knights, and those whose social rank demanded a more dignified end. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, class, and reputation, the way one died was as meaningful as the way one had lived. To die by the sword or the axe was, in its grim way, a privilege. Beheading carried deep roots in history, stretching back to ancient civilizations where the sword was not only a weapon of war, but also an instrument of justice. In medieval Europe, this legacy was preserved and redefined. The act of striking off a head was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it was swift compared to the slow strangulation of the rope, and symbolic because it represented the separation of body and soul, life and death, in a single decisive blow, unlike the gallows, which were often raised in public squares or at the edges of towns. Beheadings took place in carefully chosen locations. A scaffold might be built for the occasion, raised high enough that all could see. In some cases, the execution occurred on a grassy field outside the walls, with banners and soldiers present to give the event the air of ceremony. The location itself sent a message. This was not the messy punishment of common crime. This was justice, wrapped in ritual and framed by dignity. The condemned nobleman or woman was often allowed certain privileges before death. They might dress in their finest garments, as if for a final audience before the world. They were sometimes permitted to speak, offering last words to the gathered crowd. These speeches became legendary, remembered in chronicles and retold in taverns and halls. A noble might declare loyalty to the crown even in death, or protest innocence, or remind the crowd of their deeds in life. Whatever words were spoken, they carried the weight of finality, a performance that sealed their reputation for generations. The weapon itself varied by region. In England, the axe was the preferred tool, heavy and broad, capable of severing the neck in a single stroke if wielded skillfully. In much of continental Europe, the sword was used, its sharp blade delivering a cleaner cut. Both weapons required precision and strength, and the executioner's skill was paramount. A clean beheading was seen as a mark of professionalism and mercy. A clumsy strike, leaving the victim to suffer blow after blow, was considered both disgraceful and horrifying. Executioners who specialized in beheadings were often both feared and respected. Their role was paradoxical. They were outcasts, shunned in daily life for dealing in blood and death, yet at the moment of execution, they became central figures in the performance of justice. A skilled executioner could bring honor to the condemned by granting them a swift death. An unskilled one could turn the event into a nightmare, remembered for its brutality. Chronicles record instances where multiple strokes were required, and the crowd erupted in anger, cursing the executioner for prolonging the suffering. The condemned themselves often approached beheading with a strange mix of fear and acceptance. Some displayed remarkable composure, kneeling calmly, arranging their clothes so as not to appear disheveled, and even forgiving the executioner before the fatal blow. Others trembled, resisted, or tried to delay the inevitable, clinging to the last moments of life. The ritual often included prayer, with priests at hand to offer final blessings and absolution. In this way, the act was framed not just as punishment, but as a passage of the soul, a transition from earthly judgment to divine reckoning. In certain cases, beheading was also a spectacle of politics. Kings and rulers used it as a tool to eliminate rivals while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. A noble accused of treason might be led to the block, not because of their crimes, but because their existence threatened the throne. Yet the ritual of beheading cloaked this act in the language of justice. To the watching crowd, it was not murder but lawful execution, sanctified by custom and authority. The execution block itself became a symbol, carved of sturdy wood, often stained by years of use. It was the final resting place of many lives. The condemned would kneel, placing their neck upon its surface, awaiting the strike. Sometimes the block was elevated on a platform so the crowd could witness every detail. Other times, it was set in the open air, surrounded by soldiers to control the gathering throng. The sight of a noble's head rolling into a basket was as much theater as punishment, each detail choreographed to imprint its lesson. Beheadings were not limited to men. Women of noble birth, accused of treason, adultery, or conspiracy, sometimes met the same fate. In these cases, the ceremony carried additional weight, for the execution of a lady shocked the sensibilities of the age. Chronicles describe queens and duchesses walking with poise to the scaffold, dressed in gowns, their composure remembered long after their deaths. These moments were retold as both tragedies and warnings, blending morality with spectacle. The public, too, played its part. Just as with hangings, crowds gathered, filling the air with murmurs, prayers, or jeers. Some came out of loyalty, others out of curiosity, and many simply to be part of the moment. Execution Day was an event, drawing people from nearby villages. The shared experience of witnessing death bound the community together, reinforcing the collective memory of justice. For days, weeks, even years afterward, people would recall where they stood, what they saw, what words were spoken as the blade fell. Beheading also gave rise to myths and legends. Tales spread of heads that spoke after being severed, uttering prayers or curses before finally falling silent. In France, the story of Saint Denis told of a martyr who carried his own head for miles after decapitation. Such stories blurred the line between fact and miracle, feeding the medieval imagination with images of death that transcended the natural. These legends lent a sense of mystery and awe to the act of beheading, reinforcing its place not only in justice but in faith. The symbolism of beheading reached beyond the act itself. To strike off the head was to destroy the seat of reason and command, to sever the unity of body and soul. Politically, it was the destruction of leadership, the visible proof that authority had been overturned. When a rebel lord or pretender to the throne was beheaded, it was a message to all. Their cause was cut down with them. The head, often displayed on spikes or city gates, extended the punishment beyond death, turning the body into a warning that endured for weeks. Even in its brutality, beheading could inspire reflection. Chroniclers sometimes described noble deaths with admiration, noting courage, eloquence, or piety. These accounts shaped reputations, transforming condemned men and women into figures of legend. A single speech before death could alter how a person was remembered for centuries. In this sense, the scaffold became a stage. The execution a final performance where the condemned could claim dignity even as they faced annihilation. Over time, the image of the beheading became embedded in art, literature, and ritual. Illuminated manuscripts depicted scenes of execution, sometimes with gruesome detail, other times with symbolic abstraction. Plays and stories retold the drama of noble deaths, reinforcing the moral lessons. The axe, the sword, the block, these became icons, carrying meaning beyond their physical form. They represented justice, hierarchy, and the fragile line between power and ruin. Yet the reality remained stark. Beheading was death, final and irrevocable. For every tale of courage or dignity, there were countless others of fear, pain, and humiliation. The blade did not distinguish between guilt and innocence, justice and politics. It fell upon necks both noble and undeserving, shaping history with every strike. As the Middle Ages wore on, the ritual of beheading evolved. Scaffolds grew larger, crowds grew greater, and the symbolism deepened. The execution of kings and queens, such as later centuries would witness, stood as the ultimate expression of the practice, where the very heart of authority was severed before the eyes of the people. But even in its earliest forms, the act carried the same weight. Swift, brutal, symbolic, and unforgettable, the noble death, as it was called, remains one of the most haunting aspects of medieval justice. In the silence after the blow, in the stillness of the fallen head, lay the final expression of authority and defiance. And in the memory of those who watched, the lesson lingered, that even the highest could fall, that even the most powerful could kneel, that justice, whether true or manipulated, was as sharp and unrelenting as the blade itself. Chapter 4. Burning at the stake. Fire as purification and punishment. Among the many forms of execution in the medieval world, none carried the weight of spectacle, symbolism, and sheer terror quite like burning at the stake. Fire was not only a tool of death, it was a statement, a ritual, and, in the eyes of the church and secular rulers, a means of purification, where the axe or the rope might bring death in moments. Fire consumed slowly, painfully, and publicly, transforming the execution ground into both a theater and a sermon. The choice of fire as punishment was not arbitrary. In Christian thought, fire was deeply symbolic. It represented hell, eternal damnation, and the consuming wrath of God. To burn a heretic or a witch was not merely to kill them, but to send a message that their body and soul were being purged of corruption, and that their fate mirrored the torments of the damned. This blending of spiritual symbolism with public justice made burning at the stake one of the most feared punishments in medieval Europe. The origins of this practice lay in antiquity, where fire had been used to punish crimes against religion or the state. But in the Middle Ages, burning became most closely associated with crimes against the church, heresy, blasphemy, sorcery, and witchcraft. These were seen not simply as legal violations, but as existential threats to the fabric of Christian society. A thief might disrupt commerce, a murderer might take a life, but a heretic endangered souls, leading entire communities astray. For such offenses, ordinary punishments were considered inadequate. Only fire, with its spiritual resonance, could match the gravity of the crime. The preparation for a burning at the stake was itself a ritual. In towns and cities, word would spread in advance, drawing crowds from villages and countryside. Carpenters erected wooden stakes in prominent squares or fields, surrounding them with faggots of dry wood, straw, and pitch. Sometimes multiple stakes were prepared, allowing several condemned to burn at once in a grim display of unity. Soldiers were stationed to control the gathering throngs, for the event was as much about order as it was about punishment. On the day of execution, the condemned was led through the streets in procession. Bound, shackled, or chained, they were often dressed in simple garments, stripped of insignia, wealth, or dignity. In cases of heresy or witchcraft, a distinctive garment called a sambenito might be worn, emblazoned with symbols of their alleged sins, flames, demons, or serpents painted in crude strokes. The procession was accompanied by priests chanting prayers, urging the condemned to confess and repent even in their final moments. The journey to the stake was as symbolic as the death itself, a public parade of shame designed to impress upon all who watched the consequences of defying divine and earthly authority. Upon reaching the stake, the condemned was bound tightly with ropes or iron chains. Some accounts speak of executioners taking care to secure the body so the victim could not move, while others describe looser bindings that allowed the condemned to struggle visibly as the flames rose. At the base of the stake, the faggots were piled high, sometimes soaked in pitch, oil, or resin to ensure they caught quickly. In some cases, a pouch of gunpowder was tied around the neck or chest of the victim, a grisly mercy intended to hasten death with a sudden explosion. The crowd's anticipation at this moment was palpable. Silence often fell as priests approached the condemned, offering one final chance for confession and repentance. Acceptance might mean a quicker death, sometimes even a commutation of the sentence if the authorities wished to show mercy. Refusal, defiance, or silence, however, only heightened the drama. Chroniclers recorded moments where heretics defiantly declared their beliefs as the flames were lit, turning their deaths into acts of resistance and martyrdom. When the torches were set to the faggots, the fire crackled and roared, climbing upward in waves of heat and smoke. The victims' cries mingled with the sound of burning wood, filling the square. The scent of smoke, mingled with the stench of burning flesh, lingered in the air, embedding itself in the memory of all who watched. For the condemned, death might come swiftly from inhalation of smoke, or slowly through burning, depending on the wind, the arrangement of the pyre, and the cruelty or mercy of the executioners. The burning was more than punishment. It was spectacle. Crowds pressed forward to see, parents held children on their shoulders, and chroniclers scribbled notes. Just as sermons and festivals bound communities together, so too did executions. They reinforced collective morality, demonstrating the consequences of straying from the path of obedience. But unlike a festival, a burning was meant to instill fear as much as unity, to remind all present of the invisible but ever-present dangers of sin and dissent. Certain executions became legendary, remembered for centuries. One of the most famous was the burning of Joan of Arc in 1431. Accused of heresy and witchcraft, she was tied to a stake in Rouen and set alight before a vast crowd. Accounts describe her praying, calling upon saints, and displaying extraordinary composure even as the flames consumed her. Her death transformed her from heretic to martyr, reshaping her memory in ways her judges never intended. Such moments illustrate the dual-edged nature of burning at the stake. While it was meant to destroy, it often immortalized. The role of the executioner in these events was complex. Unlike beheading, which required skill, burning demanded preparation and control. The executioner ensured the pyre was built correctly, the ropes secure, and the fire well fed. Yet once the flames took hold, their control ended. The victim's suffering became a spectacle no one could interrupt. Executioners were both despised and necessary. Men whose profession placed them outside society, yet at its very heart during moments of public judgment. For the Church, fire was both symbol and tool. Burning heretics was seen as an extension of divine justice, a reflection of the eternal fires awaiting the damned. Priests often framed the execution as an act of mercy, cleansing the soul through suffering. The rhetoric of purification gave spiritual weight to what was, in reality, a deeply physical and horrifying death. To the faithful, the flames were not only destroying flesh, they were illuminating truth, yet not all were convinced. Among the crowds, whispers sometimes spread that the condemned had been wrongly accused, that the punishment was too severe, that the Church's power was too absolute. Burning at the stake, for all its intended symbolism, also revealed the fragility of authority. The sight of a human body writhing in flames could stir pity as easily as fear. In some cases, the ashes of martyrs were collected secretly by followers, preserved as relics of defiance. The aftermath of a burning was itself ritualized. Once the flames had consumed the body, the ashes were often scattered to the wind or thrown into rivers to prevent relics from being venerated. In other cases, bones or charred remains were displayed as warnings. The site of execution became a place of memory, revisited in stories, songs, and, in some cases, pilgrimages. Fire, though destructive, left marks that endured. In examining burning at the stake, one must also recognize its psychological power. It was not only about the death of one individual, but about shaping the minds of thousands. The memory of fire lingered, carried home by those who witnessed it, retold by those who heard the tale secondhand. Parents might warn children with words like, "Stray from the faith, and you too may meet the flames." The punishment extended beyond the condemned, embedding itself into the cultural consciousness. Over time, the practice evolved. By the late Middle Ages, burning was increasingly associated with witch trials, especially in regions where belief in sorcery and diabolism ran high. Women accused of witchcraft, often marginalized or vulnerable, were led to the stake in growing numbers. Entire communities gathered to watch, their fears projected onto the flames that consumed the accused. These burnings revealed not only the cruelty of the practice, but the anxieties of the age, the fear of the unknown, the need to find scapegoats, the desperate desire for control in a chaotic world. Yet, even as fire destroyed, it also inspired resistance. The bravery of those who met their fate with composure, prayer, or defiance challenged the very systems that condemned them. In burning heretics and witches, authorities hoped to silence dissent. Instead, they sometimes planted the seeds of rebellion, reform, and change. The flames intended to terrify could also ignite conviction. Burning at the stake remains one of the most iconic images of medieval punishment, a symbol of both cruelty and faith. It reveals a society where justice and ritual were inseparable, where punishment was performance, and where the boundary between fear and belief was blurred by the smoke of pyres. The crackle of fire, the glow of flames against dark skies, the cries of the dying, all these shaped the medieval imagination, embedding themselves into memory, legend, and history. As we reflect upon this grim chapter, it is important to remember the paradox of fire in the Middle Ages. It was warmth, life, and light, yet also death, destruction, and judgment. At the stake, these meanings converged. turning punishment into both terror and symbol. The condemned became both victim and lesson, their bodies fuel for the flames, their death stories for the living. In the end, the burning stake stood not only as a tool of execution, but as a mirror of the medieval world itself. Chapter 5. The Breaking Wheel, turning justice into suffering. If fire symbolized the wrath of God, then the wheel symbolized the grinding cruelty of man. Among the most infamous punishments of the Middle Ages, the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, was not only a method of execution but a prolonged spectacle of suffering. Where burning consumed, the wheel shattered. Where the stake purified, the wheel destroyed. To witness its use was to confront the most brutal extremes of medieval justice, a reminder that law was not merely about death, but about the calculated theater of pain. The wheel's origins stretched back to antiquity, but it was in the medieval era that it became a central part of public executions, especially for crimes considered particularly heinous: murder, treason, banditry, or acts that threatened the stability of society. To die upon the wheel was to endure not only the loss of life, but the stripping away of humanity, as the condemned was displayed like broken kindling for the community to see. The wheel itself was deceptively ordinary in appearance. Often, it was a large wagon wheel, stripped of its axle, set horizontally on a platform or vertically on a post. But in the hands of executioners, this simple object became an instrument of unimaginable torment. The condemned was first laid upon the ground, their limbs spread wide in a cross-like shape. Then the executioner, wielding a heavy iron bar or hammer, began the grisly work, shattering the arms and legs, bone by bone, joint by joint, until the body was reduced to twisted wreckage. Each strike was deliberate, each crack of bone accompanied by the roar of the crowd or the solemn murmurs of priests. The number and sequence of blows varied depending on the crime, the region, and the orders of the court. Some condemned were granted a merciful blow to the chest or head early in the ordeal, ensuring quick death. Others, however, were denied such mercy, forced to linger in agony as their broken limbs were threaded through the spokes of the wheel. The executioner's skill lay in prolonging suffering without delivering immediate death, a grim expertise honed through years of practice. Once the breaking was complete, the mangled body was bound to the wheel itself, woven through the wooden spokes like a grotesque tapestry. The wheel was then raised upon a post, displayed high above the crowd. There, exposed to sun, wind, and scavenging birds, the condemned lingered, sometimes still alive, groaning in pain, sometimes already dead. In either case, the display served its purpose, to remind all who gazed upon it of the fate awaiting those who defied the law. The symbolism of the wheel was powerful. Its circular shape suggested the turning of fortune, the relentless cycles of sin and punishment, life and death. In Christian thought, it could even be seen as an inversion of the holy wheel of fate, a perverse reflection of divine justice. To be broken upon the wheel was to be cast out of the order of human life, reduced to fragments and displayed as a warning. The breaking wheel was not merely a punishment, it was a performance. Crowds gathered eagerly, their presence turning the execution into a communal event. Children clung to their parents, apprentices whispered among themselves, nobles watched from balconies. The wheel transformed the town square into a stage where fear and fascination mingled. Chroniclers noted how some in the crowd fainted at the sight, while others cheered at each blow. It was as much a ritual as a legal act, binding the community together through shared horror. For the condemned, reactions varied. Some wept, begged, or prayed as the first blows fell. Others met their fate with stoic silence or even defiance, cursing their executioners or crying out to the heavens. Legends abound of criminals who endured strike after strike without sound, their endurance becoming part of local lore. whether in agony or defiance. Each response added to the drama of the moment, reinforcing the wheel's reputation as the most dreaded of punishments. Certain executions became infamous, remembered in chronicles and ballads. Bandits and highwaymen, whose crimes disrupted commerce and safety, were often condemned to the wheel, their bodies left displayed along roadsides as warnings. In some cases, dozens of wheels lined a single stretch of road, each bearing the shattered remains of an outlaw. The sight was intended to terrify travelers into obedience, but it also became a grim landmark. Shaping the geography of fear. One notable case was that of Peter Stumpf, a German farmer accused in the 16th century of witchcraft, cannibalism, and murder. His execution combined burning and breaking, beginning with mutilation and ending with his body stretched across the wheel. Though sensationalized, his story reveals the persistence of the wheel as both punishment and legend. Even into the later Renaissance, the Church, as with many punishments, provided theological justification. The body, it was said, represented sin, and breaking it was a way of cleansing the soul. Priests stood by the wheel, urging repentance, offering last rites to those who confessed. Yet the wheel also revealed the paradox of medieval piety, an institution devoted to mercy and salvation condoned, and even sanctified, the slow destruction of human bodies. Faith and brutality intertwined in ways that defy modern sensibilities. The wheel also carried political weight. Executing traitors or rebels upon the wheel was a statement of power, a demonstration that defiance against crown or lord would end not only in death, but in utter humiliation. To see a rebel's body displayed upon the wheel was to see the futility of resistance. The punishment extended beyond the individual, crushing the spirit of entire communities and reinforcing hierarchies. Yet, for all its cruelty, the breaking wheel was not simply an invention of sadism. It was rooted in a medieval worldview where justice was public, visible, and symbolic. Punishment was not merely about retribution. It was about education, deterrence, and the reinforcement of order. The wheel dramatized the consequences of crime, turning execution into a form of storytelling. Each broken body told a tale of law, sin, and consequence, a narrative etched in bone and blood. Despite its intended purpose, the wheel sometimes backfired. The sheer horror of the punishment could evoke pity, turning criminals into martyrs in the eyes of the crowd. Chroniclers record instances where onlookers wept openly, begging for mercy, or where executioners were cursed for their cruelty. In these moments, the wheel revealed the fragility of justice, showing how easily spectacle could slip into scandal. Over time, the use of the wheel declined, especially as attitudes toward punishment shifted in the early modern era. The rise of more efficient methods, such as hanging or beheading, reflected growing unease with prolonged suffering. Yet the memory of the wheel lingered, preserved in folklore, literature, and even art. Its image haunted the imagination, a symbol of cruelty and fate. In modern times, the wheel is remembered less as a tool of justice and more as a symbol of medieval brutality. Its very name conjures images of suffering and horror, reinforcing stereotypes of the Middle Ages as a time of darkness and cruelty. Yet, in understanding the wheel, we gain insight not only into the past, but into the nature of justice itself, the ways societies use pain and spectacle to enforce order, the ways punishment reflects culture, belief, and fear. The breaking wheel stands as one of the starkest reminders of how far humanity has come and how close we remain to the shadows of our past. Its story is not only about medieval Europe, but about the enduring human fascination with punishment, spectacle, and the thin line between justice and cruelty. As the wheel turned in the town square, cracking bones beneath iron and wood. It turned also in the minds of those who watched, etching itself into memory. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of that will still resound, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, the power of law, and the brutal theater of justice in a world governed by fear and order. Chapter 6. Hanging and the Gallows. Justice suspended in the air. Among all the punishments of the Middle Ages, few proved as enduring or as symbolic as hanging. The gallows stood not just as a tool of execution, but as a monument of fear and authority, towering above villages, towns, and crossroads. Where the breaking wheel shattered the body, hanging suspended it, leaving it swaying in the wind like a living or lifeless warning. In many ways, the gallows was the most democratic of punishments. Nobles who betrayed their king might lose their heads with the sword, and heretics might burn at the stake, but the common thief, the murderer, and the highwayman were most often destined for the rope. Hanging became the execution of the people, so common, so familiar, that it shaped language, folklore, and even architecture. The gallows itself was usually a simple structure, two upright beams with a crossbeam, from which ropes were tied. In some cases, a single tree branch sufficed. In others, massive stone and wooden scaffolds were built to accommodate dozens of condemned at once. These constructions were deliberately placed in visible locations, atop hills, at town gates, or along well-traveled roads. The purpose was clear. The gallows was not hidden away. It was a reminder that crime ended in death, and that death was public. The act of hanging was, at first glance, straightforward, a rope around the neck, the body suspended until life slipped away. But the methods varied, and each detail carried meaning. In early medieval practice, the condemned was often hoisted slowly into the air, left to choke and strangle as the crowd watched. This short drop offered no quick death. Instead, it brought long minutes of suffocation, the face darkening, the legs thrashing, the chest heaving desperately for breath. Executioners, in their grim expertise, sometimes modified the process. A stool might be kicked away, or the condemned pushed from a cart, leaving them dangling in the air. In some cases, the rope was tied poorly, allowing the victim to twist and struggle for what seemed an eternity. To die upon the gallows was rarely clean. It was an ordeal, and its spectacle was part of the punishment. Later innovations, particularly in the early modern period, introduced the long drop, calculated to break the neck swiftly. But in the Middle Ages, such merciful precision was rare. Hanging was not meant to be quick, it was meant to be seen. The flailing of limbs, the desperate gasps, the final stillness, all of it reminded the crowd of both the power of law and the fragility of life. The symbolism of hanging was profound. To be suspended between earth and sky was to be denied both. The condemned belonged neither to the living nor to the dead, trapped in a liminal space. For some, this was seen as spiritual punishment, a denial of burial in consecrated ground, a statement that the sinner was rejected both by man and by God. The gallows thus became more than an instrument of execution. It was a stage of exile, where the body itself testified to guilt and disgrace. Hanging was often accompanied by ritual. Processions led the condemned from prison to the scaffold, sometimes allowing time for confession, sometimes forcing them to wear symbols of their crime, ropes, chains, or placards. Priests walked alongside, urging repentance, while crowds lined the streets. In these moments, the execution became a community event, a grim festival where fear mingled with curiosity. The condemned themselves reacted in many ways. Some broke down in tears, pleading for mercy or forgiveness. Others embraced the moment, delivering final speeches that echoed through the crowd. Medieval records contain accounts of criminals who confessed their sins publicly, urging spectators to live virtuously, hoping their own death might serve as a warning. Others cursed their executioners or defiantly declared innocence, turning the gallows into a pulpit of protest. These final words often lived on in folklore, remembered long after the rope had rotted away. The gallows could also become a place of spectacle beyond execution itself. Bodies were sometimes left hanging long after death, swaying in the wind, blackened by sun and rain, picked apart by crows. This was deliberate. The sight of a corpse at the crossroads was as much a deterrent as the execution itself. Travelers paused, shuddered, and hurried past, reminded that crime left not only disgrace but a body abandoned to the elements that lie in some regions. Gallows were permanent structures, known landmarks that dominated the landscape. London's infamous Tyburn, for example, became synonymous with hanging, its triple gallows able to hold dozens at once. But even in smaller towns, the presence of gallows carried weight. A village with its own scaffold reminded all who entered that justice awaited the wicked. The choice of hanging for criminals was not accidental. It was seen as a base punishment, suited to the dishonorable. Nobles were rarely hanged, their rank sparing them the humiliation. Instead, hanging marked the boundary between classes, a visible reminder of hierarchy. To be hanged was to be disgraced, stripped not only of life, but of dignity. Folklore and ballads often grew from these scenes. Outlaws, especially, were romanticized in death, their bodies swinging on the gallows becoming part of legend. Tales of Robin Hood, for example, often referenced the threat of hanging, adding drama to his defiance of law. Songs about highwaymen and bandits circulated, transforming criminals into folk heroes. Their gallows deaths seen not only as punishment, but as symbols of rebellion. At times, executions by hanging became massive public events. Festivals of death, where hundreds gathered, food was sold, and jesters entertained the crowd while waiting for the fatal moment. The condemned walked among a sea of eyes, their steps heavy with the weight of inevitability. To modern sensibilities, such scenes seem macabre, yet in the medieval world they were woven into the fabric of community life. Punishment was not hidden. It was shared. The role of the executioner was crucial. Though despised and often shunned socially, he was necessary, and his skill determined the swiftness, or slowness, of death. A poorly tied knot or misjudged height could lead to agonizing failure, forcing the condemned to strangle slowly while the crowd jeered. Conversely, a swift execution could be met with murmurs of approval. Executioners carried both the weight of justice and the scorn of society, forever bound to the scaffold they served. Religious symbolism also accompanied the gallows. Priests framed the execution as an opportunity for repentance, urging the condemned to embrace death as purification. Hanging became, in their sermons, not only punishment but penance. Yet the contradiction was stark. The rope that strangled was also preached as the rope that saved. A paradox that reveals the complex intertwining of faith and violence in the medieval mind. Over time, gallows themselves became markers of justice in art and literature. They appeared in manuscripts, woodcuts, and plays, their image instantly understood. The sight of a hanging man carried layered meanings: fear, justice, humiliation, but also, at times, redemption. The gallows was at once ordinary and extraordinary, a symbol that loomed over medieval culture like the scaffold itself over the town square. As centuries passed, the practice of hanging evolved. By the late Middle Ages, the spectacle remained, but attitudes slowly shifted toward efficiency. Still, the gallows continued to dominate, surviving well into the modern age, its legacy lingering even after public executions faded. Today, hanging is remembered as one of the archetypal medieval punishments: brutal, public, and symbolic. It shaped not only justice but language itself. Phrases like "at the end of one's rope," "suspended judgment," or "gallows humor" remind us how deeply the practice embedded itself into culture. Imagine the gallows of the Middle Ages is to see more than a rope and beam. It is to see a community gathered in uneasy unity, a body dangling in silence, and the wind carrying the lesson of law across fields and roads. It is to see justice not as hidden procedure, but as open theater, where death itself was made to speak. The gallows stood tall, its ropes creaking in the breeze. For centuries, it cast its shadow across medieval Europe, a reminder that in a world where law was fragile and order precious, justice was written not only in words and decrees, but in the swaying of a body against the sky. Chapter 7. Beheading. The sword and the axe as instruments of honor and terror. While hanging was the punishment of the commoner, beheading occupied a different space in the medieval imagination. It was swift, decisive, and, in many cases, reserved for the nobility or those whose social standing demanded a measure of dignity, even in death. Yet while the act promised speed, it carried a profound psychological weight, both for the condemned and for those who witnessed it. The sword and the axe were instruments of law, yet also of terror, symbols that life could end in a single stroke and that justice was absolute. Beheading in the Middle Ages was a ritual as much as a punishment. It required careful preparation, precise technique, and, often, an audience to witness the finality of the law. The condemned was brought forth, sometimes on a cart, sometimes walking through the streets, their hands bound, face pale but composed. Clerics often accompanied them, offering the last rites or prayers for salvation. This blending of religion and execution was typical, a reminder that even in death, the soul's fate mattered as much as the body's. The instruments themselves were chosen with intention. The sword, often the weapon of a trained executioner, symbolized honor. Its blade was sharp, capable of delivering a clean, swift cut. The axe, in contrast, conveyed brute strength, its weight and swing more intimidating, capable of chopping through bone with terrifying efficiency. Both carried a symbolic resonance, the sword for the noble, the axe for the commoner, yet both signaled the irrevocable judgment of the law. The process of beheading demanded skill. A poorly executed strike could result in a botched execution, prolonging suffering and horrifying the onlookers. Executioners trained extensively, learning to measure distance, angle, and force to ensure that a single stroke could sever life. In some cases, assistants would help position the condemned, securing the neck and preparing the block or scaffold to ensure precision. These preparations were ritualized, a silent choreography that combined authority, fear, and expertise. Public beheadings were, like hangings, theatrical in nature. Townspeople would gather in squares, along streets, or near castle walls to witness the event. The spectacle was intended to impress upon the community the power of law, the finality of judgment, and the consequences of crime. Yet, unlike the drawn-out horror of hanging, beheading was often over in moments. The swift drop of the axe or the flash of the sword's blade delivered both terror and release, a concentrated demonstration of the state's authority. Social status dictated both method and location. Nobles condemned for treason, rebellion, or murder were often decapitated within castle walls, shielded from the mass public, preserving a measure of dignity and avoiding the scandal of a body swinging in public. Commoners, on the other hand, might be executed at crossroads, marketplaces, or other prominent locations, ensuring that their death became a warning to all. The distinction between classes was literal and symbolic, a reflection of medieval hierarchy that permeated every aspect of justice. The psychological impact of beheading extended beyond the condemned. Crowds, gathered in anticipation, watched as life was extinguished in a single stroke. The shock of immediacy, the vivid demonstration of mortality, instilled both fear and obedience. Chronicles describe the awe and horror that accompanied noble executions, the silence that fell after the swing of the axe, and the collective recognition that law was not to be defied. These moments became part of communal memory, recounted in stories and songs, reinforcing moral and social norms. The condemned themselves approached the scaffold in varied states. Some faced death with resignation, praying or reciting confessions as they awaited the blade. Others resisted, trembling or begging for mercy, their voices echoing against stone walls and wooden platforms. In some cases, condemned individuals delivered final speeches, denouncing enemies, confessing sins, or offering moral lessons to the gathered populace. These words often lived on in chronicles, ensuring that their lives and their crimes were remembered alongside their deaths. Executioners, despite their feared status, were central figures in this ritual. Their skill determined whether death would be swift or prolonged. The position of the head, the angle of the swing, and the firmness of the strike were all crucial. Inexperienced or careless executioners could provoke public outrage if a noble's death was botched, while a flawless execution reinforced both authority and trust in justice. These men, often shunned socially yet essential to law, embodied the paradox of fear and necessity that defined medieval punishment. Beheading was also symbolic. In a society deeply aware of honor and reputation, to be executed by sword or axe was to die visibly, but with a measure of dignity. It was the removal of life, but not necessarily the removal of status. Heads were sometimes displayed after execution, particularly for traitors or rebels. Yet the method suggested that the condemned had at least faced the law on terms somewhat proportionate to their rank. The ritual could vary dramatically depending on region and period. In England, the axe often carried a fearsome reputation, while in France, the sword of the executioner was revered for its precision. In Germany, the condemned might kneel on a specially designed block, neck exposed, awaiting a calculated strike that demonstrated both efficiency and authority. Despite these differences, the underlying principles remained. Beheading was swift, visible, and symbolic. Religious elements were often interwoven. The condemned might receive a priest's counsel or blessing, and prayers were offered for the salvation of the soul. Execution was framed as both punishment and moral lesson. The belief was that even in physical death, repentance could ensure spiritual redemption. Yet the duality was clear. The body was destroyed, and the mind of the community was instructed in obedience, fear, and respect. Beheading was also used as a political tool. Monarchs and rulers often ordered executions to quell dissent, eliminate rivals, or demonstrate absolute authority. High-profile decapitations were designed to send messages far beyond the scaffold, affecting allies, enemies, and the general populace alike. In some cases, the severed head was paraded through towns, displayed on gates, or sent to neighboring territories as a warning. The visual power of death communicated what words alone could not. Over time, the act of beheading gained cultural resonance. Tales of traitors, rebels, and criminals who met their end at the sword or axe were preserved in literature, chronicles, and folklore. The image of a head falling in a single, swift motion became emblematic of justice, terror, and mortality. In plays, poems, and moral tales, the executioner's blade symbolized the inescapability of law, the finality of judgment, and the fragility of life. In practice, executioners were meticulous. A sharp blade, measured swing, and steady hand were essential. Medieval records recount instances where multiple blows were required, revealing both human error and the challenges of delivering justice with precision. When done correctly, the act could be both efficient and horrifyingly beautiful in its finality, a paradox that medieval society seemed to accept as a necessary aspect of governance. For the condemned, the psychological journey was intense. Some approached death with dignity, others with terror, and many with a mix of resignation and fear. The moments leading up to the strike were charged with emotion, prayers whispered, confessions made, final words spoken. These experiences were recorded meticulously, forming the basis of historical accounts that allow us to understand not just the mechanics of execution, but the human drama surrounding it. Beheading, in its brutality and efficiency, reflected the duality of medieval justice, swift yet symbolic, terrifying yet regulated, public yet infused with ritual. It was a method that reinforced social hierarchies, communicated authority, and provided a stage for both morality and spectacle. Whether carried out by sword or axe, in castles or market squares, the act of beheading shaped the perception of law and punishment for centuries. The legacy of beheading endures, not only in historical memory, but in language, literature, and culture. Phrases like "off with his head" echo across centuries, a reminder of the medieval imagination's fascination with life, death, and justice. The gallant executioner, the dignified condemned, and the assembled crowd together created a ritual that was simultaneously legal, social, and theatrical, encapsulating the complex moral and practical world of medieval punishment. To witness a medieval beheading in thought is to enter a world where law was physical, honor was measured, and life could end in an instant. The sword and the axe were not merely instruments of execution. They were symbols of authority, instruments of fear, and reminders that justice in the Middle Ages was as much about demonstration as it was about penalty. As the condemned fell, the crowd would release a collective shudder or sigh, a moment of shared recognition that life had been claimed by law. And yet, beyond the fear, there was also understanding that society, fragile and hierarchical, depended upon the enforcement of rules, and that the blade of justice, though sharp and merciless, was the instrument by which order was maintained. Beheading, with all its ritual, terror, and symbolic resonance, stands as one of the defining punishments of medieval Europe. It reveals a society obsessed with authority, conscious of social rank, and willing to marry fear with ceremony to sustain itself. Chapter 8. Burning at the stake. Fire as punishment and purification. Fire, one of the oldest elements of fear and fascination, became a central instrument of justice in the Middle Ages. To be burned at the stake was not merely to die. It was to endure a public, painful, and symbolic act that transcended the physical world, leaving an indelible mark on communities, memory, and the imagination. From the earliest heretics to accused witches, burning at the stake was both punishment and warning, blending terror, spectacle, and moral authority into a single, searing moment. The ritual of burning was as deliberate as it was horrifying. The condemned were often led through streets, sometimes in chains, accompanied by guards, clergy, and occasionally a public procession. They might carry the instruments of their supposed crime, or wear symbols marking them as sinners. In many cases, the condemned were offered a final opportunity for repentance, a chance to recant heresy or confess guilt. This blending of religious opportunity and legal enforcement reflects the medieval understanding that punishment had both earthly and spiritual dimensions. The stake itself was prepared with care. Wood was arranged to ensure that flames would reach the body fully, while sometimes a pyre was built to maximize visibility. Townsfolk would gather at safe distances, forming a circle around the execution site. The rising smoke, the crackle of flames, and the sight of the condemned enveloped by fire created a dramatic, terrifying spectacle. The public nature of the event was intentional. Punishment was as much about deterring others as it was about punishing the individual. Victims of burning were typically accused of crimes that threatened social, religious, or moral order. Heresy, witchcraft, and treason were the most common offenses. Each carried a symbolic weight, Heretics defied divine law, witches corrupted society with dark magic, and traitors undermined the fragile hierarchies that maintained peace and order. By burning the guilty, authorities claimed both justice and spiritual purification, eradicating not only the body but, they believed, the evil within the soul. Religious figures often played a central role in these executions. Priests and monks accompanied the condemned, offering prayers and sacraments. Confessions were encouraged or extracted, sometimes at the stake itself, to ensure that the soul could be reconciled with God before death. In this way, burning was framed as a purifying act, a terrifying yet necessary step in restoring divine order. For the spectators, it reinforced the connection between law, morality, and faith, teaching obedience through spectacle. The condemned themselves displayed a wide range of responses. Some approached the pyre with resignation, silently praying or reciting prayers aloud. Others displayed terror, struggling against their restraints, screaming, or pleading for mercy. Chroniclers of the time often recorded these final moments in detail, noting the courage, despair, or defiance of the condemned. In these accounts, the humanity of the individual emerges, contrasting starkly with the methodical and impersonal nature of the execution. Burning at the stake was both painful and symbolic. The flames consumed the body while simultaneously sending a message. Defiance against social or divine law would not go unpunished. The visual power of fire, the smoke rising into the sky, the vivid orange and red flames, the sound of crackling wood, made the act unforgettable for witnesses. It created a narrative that would be told and retold in homes, markets, and religious institutions, ensuring that the memory of punishment lingered long after the fire was extinguished. The method of execution varied depending on local customs and the nature of the crime. In some regions, the condemned were tied to a stake, with wood piled around them and set alight. In other cases, they might be strangled or garroted before burning, either as an act of mercy or due to tradition. The preparation of the pyre was meticulous, ensuring maximum visibility and dramatic effect. Executioners coordinated the timing. Guards maintained order, and clergy performed final rites, all creating a carefully choreographed, terrifying ritual. Accusations leading to burning were often fueled by fear, superstition, and social tension. Women accused of witchcraft, for example, might have been healers, midwives, or simply those living on the margins of society. Religious dissenters challenged the authority of the church, questioning dogma or spreading new interpretations of faith. Political rebels or traitors threatened the fragile alliances that maintained peace in feudal societies. In all cases, the act of burning communicated that certain offenses could not be tolerated, visually demonstrating the cost of defiance. The psychological impact extended beyond the condemned. Witnesses, including children, merchants, and nobility, were confronted with the ultimate consequence of crime or heresy. Fear of such punishment reinforced obedience, ensuring that social norms, religious orthodoxy, and political hierarchies were maintained. The act of watching a body consumed by fire created a collective memory, binding communities together in recognition of authority and consequence. Executioners played a key role in maintaining both the effectiveness and the spectacle of the punishment. Their task required precision and control, ensuring that the pyre was constructed correctly and that the condemned remained in position. They were feared for their skill and power, yet often shunned socially, embodying the paradox of being essential yet socially isolated. Their work exemplified the brutal pragmatism of medieval justice. Punishment was a tool of fear, deterrence, and societal cohesion. Over time, the method gained cultural resonance. Burning became synonymous with ultimate punishment, with imagery and descriptions appearing in chronicles, literature, and folklore. Stories of martyrs and sinners consumed by fire were recounted to reinforce moral and religious lessons. The act became a powerful narrative device, symbolizing purification, terror, and the consequences of challenging established order. Religious justification remained central. The Church framed executions as purifying acts that cleansed the soul even as the body was destroyed. Fire symbolized divine wrath, and the presence of clergy ensured that spiritual reconciliation could occur. The mingling of fear, morality, and ritual transformed the act into more than punishment. It became a moral and spiritual lesson for all who witnessed it. Communities internalized these lessons. Tales of witches, heretics, and traitors served as cautionary stories. Children grew up with vivid images of fire, punishment, and obedience. Social behavior was influenced not only by law but by fear of divine retribution, reinforced through dramatic and unforgettable public executions. The burning at the stake was thus an instrument of both law and culture, shaping perception, morality, and societal order. The legacy of these executions persists in historical memory. Chroniclers, poets, and later historians preserved the accounts, capturing both the horror and the ritualized nature of the punishment. The symbolism of fire as purgation and punishment influenced later legal systems, literature, and artistic depictions, embedding a sense of awe and terror that transcended the immediate moment, in the quiet contemplation of history. The image of a body enveloped in flames evokes both fear and understanding. Medieval societies relied on such extreme measures to maintain order, using terror to reinforce obedience and authority. Fire, destructive yet transformative, became a visual shorthand for justice, morality, and the fragility of life. Burning at the stake, therefore, stands as one of the most vivid symbols of medieval punishment. It reminds us that law, faith, and societal order were intertwined, and that justice in the Middle Ages was both physical and symbolic. The act conveyed morality, authority, and consequence in a way that left an indelible mark on both the individual and the community, ensuring that the lessons of fire would endure for generations. As the smoke rose into the sky and embers fell to the ground, medieval witnesses absorbed a lesson in mortality, obedience, and divine judgment. The act of burning, terrifying and mesmerizing, symbolized a world in which law was inseparable from fear, faith, and spectacle. It remains, in memory and in history, a profound example of how societies enforce order through the most primal and elemental of means, fire. Chapter 9. Torture and Trial by Ordeal. Seeking truth through pain. In the medieval world, the pursuit of truth often intertwined with fear, suffering, and ritualized violence. Justice was not always blind or measured by evidence alone. It was sometimes tested through the body, through pain, and through the endurance of extreme trial. Torture and the trial by ordeal became instruments by which medieval societies sought to determine guilt or innocence, often leaving spectators both horrified and mesmerized. These practices reveal a world where the line between law, superstition, and spectacle blurred, and where the human body became both the instrument and the test of justice. Torture was not employed casually. Authorities relied on it to extract confessions, intimidate, or confirm accusations. Instruments of pain were designed with grim ingenuity. Racks stretched bodies until joints dislocated. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, and iron collars or chairs held the accused immobile while inflicting agonizing pressure. Torture was framed as a tool of revelation, a means to unearth the hidden truth that words alone might conceal. It was also a public warning, demonstrating the power of law and the peril of defiance. Trial by ordeal, a related but distinct practice, was based on the belief that divine intervention would reveal guilt or innocence. These trials often involved physically daunting or dangerous acts. Accused individuals might be made to carry hot irons, plunge hands into boiling water, or swim in icy rivers. The outcome, whether they survived unscathed or suffered injury, was interpreted as a sign from God. In this worldview, justice was not solely a human prerogative. It was divinely guided, and the body became the mediator between mortal law and heavenly judgment. Water was one of the most common mediums for trial by ordeal, known as the ordeal of cold water or ordeal by floating. It involved binding the accused and immersing them in a river or pond. If they sank, they were considered innocent. If they floated, they were judged guilty. The logic, from a medieval perspective, was that water, as a pure element, would reject the guilty. Though fatal in some instances, the ordeal was seen as divinely sanctioned, a test beyond human manipulation. Fire, like in burning at the stake, was another instrument of ordeal. Accused persons might be required to hold or walk across red-hot irons, or retrieve objects from flames. Successful endurance without serious injury signified innocence. Burns or injuries signaled guilt. These trials were dramatic, public, and terrifying, emphasizing both physical courage and moral standing. The use of fire and heat also carried symbolic weight, as fire was believed to purify, punish, and reveal hidden truth. Pain, fear, and the psychological weight of these trials were compounded by social pressure. Trials were often witnessed by neighbors, clergy, and local officials, transforming justice into communal spectacle. The accused were subjected not only to physical agony, but to the scrutiny and judgment of their peers. Shame, humiliation, and terror were tools as effective as instruments of torture, reinforcing obedience and deterring crime within the wider community. Confessions extracted under torture carried significant authority in medieval courts. The logic was that no innocent person would admit guilt willingly, and that pain would break the resistance of the guilty. Yet these methods often produced false confessions, as individuals sought to end unbearable suffering. Despite this, authorities considered such confessions valid evidence, and the rituals surrounding them imbued the law with both fear and performative gravity. Ordeals were also conducted using natural elements and everyday objects. In addition to fire and water, the accused might be weighed against sacred objects, subjected to prolonged fasting, or forced into extreme postures. In some instances, animals were introduced, and survival was interpreted as divine favor. The diversity of methods reflects a society deeply intertwined with spiritual belief, superstition, and the conviction that the divine would intervene to reveal truth. The Church played a dual role in these practices. While some clerics opposed torture, citing mercy and the sanctity of the body, others sanctioned it as necessary for extracting confessions of sin or heresy. Trials by ordeal were often overseen or blessed by priests, ensuring that the divine element of justice was invoked. In this way, physical punishment, legal authority, and spiritual belief converged, creating a unique system where pain was not merely punitive but revelatory. Political and social factors often influenced the application of torture and ordeal. Accusations could stem from rivalry, jealousy, or vendetta, and authorities could manipulate the process to achieve desired outcomes. In times of unrest, trials might serve to eliminate perceived threats, consolidate power, or enforce social norms. Yet, for ordinary villagers and commoners, these practices were a reminder of the precariousness of life, the fragility of social standing, and the ever-present weight of divine and secular law. Public execution and trial by ordeal were intimately linked. Both were designed to educate and warn the community. The suffering of the accused became a story repeated in homes, markets, and religious settings. Fear of torture and ordeal reinforced obedience, while the communal witnessing of these events transformed individual punishment into a collective lesson in morality. loyalty, and submission to authority, despite the terror. Some medieval writers defended the practice of torture and ordeal as essential for maintaining justice. Chroniclers argued that divine justice could not be circumvented by clever argument or false witness. The body was the ultimate instrument of proof, and pain was a legitimate way to expose guilt. This worldview reflects a society where the boundaries of human, spiritual, and legal authority were tightly intertwined, and where survival often depended on navigating both physical danger and social expectation. Instruments of torture themselves became infamous, symbols of power, authority, and fear. The rack, Iron Maiden, wheel, and thumbscrew were not merely functional devices. They were crafted to maximize spectacle and suffering. Executioners were skilled professionals, trained in the art of inflicting pain while maintaining control and ritual. Their work made visible the power of the law and the reach of the authorities, establishing them as both feared and indispensable figures within medieval communities. The psychological effect of these trials cannot be overstated. The accused faced not only physical torment, but the terror of anticipation. The knowledge of being watched, the uncertainty of survival, and the expectation of pain created a mental landscape as punishing as the physical one. This psychological dimension extended to the audience, instilling caution, respect, and fear of transgression. Law was as much about perception as action. Seeing punishment enacted was an essential tool of control. Women and marginalized members of society were disproportionately affected. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy often targeted those with little social protection. Torture and ordeals became instruments of social policing, ensuring that those on the margins conformed or suffered. The gendered and hierarchical dynamics of these practices reflect the broader inequalities of medieval society, where power, fear, and law converged to maintain social order. Trial by ordeal gradually declined as legal systems evolved. By the late Middle Ages, skepticism about divine intervention, along with increasing reliance on evidence, testimony, and rational investigation, began to limit the use of such extreme methods. Nevertheless, their legacy endured in cultural memory, literature, and folklore, serving as reminders of a time when justice demanded both courage and suffering. As we reflect on the medieval use of torture and trial by ordeal, it becomes clear that these practices were more than acts of punishment. They were moral, social, and spiritual instruments. Pain and endurance became measures of guilt, courage, and divine favor. Witnesses learned lessons in obedience, faith, and caution, while societies reinforced hierarchies and norms. Torture and ordeal transformed law into spectacle, morality into performance, and justice into a profound, sometimes terrifying, human experience. In the quiet contemplation of history, one can almost imagine the tension before the ordeal, the trembling of the accused, the rustle of robes from priests and officials, the murmurs of the crowd, and the anticipation of judgment. It is a world where physical endurance, moral conduct, and spiritual fate were inseparable, and where the theater of pain became a central instrument of order and instruction. Torture and trial by ordeal remain among the most compelling and chilling aspects of medieval justice. They remind us that law, belief, and power were tightly interwoven, and that human experience, fear, courage, suffering, and hope was central to the administration of order. Through these stories, we glimpse a world that balanced faith, authority, and terror, where every accusation, every trial, and every moment of suffering conveyed a deeper lesson about survival, morality, and the weight of justice. Chapter 10: Execution Methods, Hanging, Beheading, and the Wheel. In the medieval world, the finality of justice often manifested in public executions, a grim theater where law, fear, and spectacle converged. Execution was not merely a punishment. It was a moral lesson, a warning, and an assertion of authority. Town squares, castle courtyards, and crossroads became stages where the guilty met their fate, and the community witnessed both the consequences of transgression and the power of the state. The methods of execution were diverse, often brutal, and each carried symbolic, psychological, and practical significance. Hanging was one of the most common forms of execution. For those convicted of theft, murder, or other serious crimes, the rope became the instrument of justice. The condemned would be led to the gallows, often preceded by a procession intended to shame them and reinforce the power of law. Crowds gathered, their silence or murmurs amplifying the gravity of the moment. The executioner, a figure both feared and respected, adjusted the noose, calculating the drop to ensure a quick death, or in some cases, to prolong suffering as a further deterrent. The act of hanging transformed the criminal into a visual warning. The suspended body symbolized the consequences of defiance, the fragility of human life, and the omnipresence of authority, beheading, a method reserved often for nobility or high-ranking individuals, combined efficiency with ritual. The executioner's sword or axe became an emblem of swift justice, designed to sever life with precision. Beheading carried both practical and symbolic meaning. It ensured a relatively quick death, but also served as a statement of the ruler's power. In some cases, the head was displayed publicly on a spike or city gate, reinforcing social order and reminding citizens that rank could not protect one from the reach of the law. The psychological impact of beheading was profound, offering a stark, memorable image of justice administered with absolute authority. The breaking wheel, or the Catherine wheel, represented one of the most feared methods of execution, reserved for those convicted of heinous crimes such as murder, treason, or robbery. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, and their limbs were methodically shattered with heavy iron bars or hammers. The executioner moved with practiced efficiency, delivering blows to maximize both agony and spectacle. In some cases, the wheel was raised on a pole, leaving the victim to die slowly under the eyes of the public. The brutality of this method was intended not merely to punish but to educate. The physical suffering of the criminal was a lesson in obedience, morality, and the consequences of defying social and legal order. Other methods of execution included burning at the stake, often used for heretics, witches, and those convicted of crimes against the church. Fire was both purifying and punitive, reducing the body to ash while serving as a warning to the living. Hanging in chains, drawing and quartering, and impalement were also employed, each chosen for the severity of the crime, the social status of the condemned, or the desired psychological effect on observers. Every method carried cultural, religious, and practical meaning, ensuring that execution was both functional and symbolic. Public execution was as much about social control as punishment. Townspeople, merchants, and peasants would gather to witness the event, their presence transforming the act into communal instruction. Fear, awe, and fascination intermingled in the crowd. The executioner's skill, the condemned's demeanor, and the rituals surrounding the event all contributed to the message. Law was absolute, and disobedience carried inevitable consequences. Children and adults alike were exposed to these spectacles, internalizing the lessons of morality, obedience, and civic duty through vivid and unforgettable images. Ritual, pageantry, and ceremony accompanied many executions. Clergy might offer last rites or prayers, reminding the condemned and the community of spiritual order. Heralds, town criers, or banners might announce the crime, the judgment, and the punishment, ensuring that the story of transgression was communicated clearly. Music, chants, or bells sometimes marked the occasion, blending the sacred and the secular in a ritualized affirmation of justice. The combination of performance and punishment reinforced both legal authority and moral hierarchy, making the execution a multi-sensory lesson in law, power, and obedience. Execution methods also reflected societal values and hierarchies. Nobles might receive beheading for the sake of speed and dignity, while commoners faced hanging or more painful forms of death. Religious crimes, particularly heresy or witchcraft, often resulted in burning at the stake, emphasizing the spiritual dimension of punishment. Thieves or petty criminals might be hanged or whipped before execution, making their final moments a public lesson in shame, deterrence, and submission. Social standing, the nature of the crime, and the intended audience all influenced how justice was executed. Preparation for execution was itself a ritualized process. The condemned were often given the opportunity for confession, prayer, or reconciliation with family and community. Clergy, friends, or officials accompanied them to the place of death, offering both spiritual support and symbolic witness. Executioners, skilled and professional, moved with precision, ensuring that the methods were carried out effectively while maximizing the communicative power of the act. Even the construction of gallows, wheels, or stakes reflected care, design, and an understanding of the psychological impact on both the condemned and the observers. The act of execution was not only punitive but also narrative. The public witnessed a story unfold: the crime, the capture, the judgment, and the final punishment. Each element reinforced societal values, communicated consequences, and provided a memorable example for those who might contemplate disobedience. In this way, executions functioned as both legal and cultural texts, encoding norms, morality, and authority into the collective consciousness. Medieval chroniclers often documented executions with meticulous detail, noting the crime, the method of punishment, and the reactions of the crowd. These records offer insight into both the legal system and the cultural attitudes of the period. Fear, spectacle, morality, and justice intersected in these narratives, providing a rich understanding of how societies understood crime, punishment, and authority. Psychological impact on the community was significant. Witnessing an execution reinforced obedience, moral behavior, and respect for authority. Fear became a tool of governance, shaping the behavior of entire towns and regions. Individuals internalized lessons not just from personal experience, but from communal witnessing, ensuring that the power of law extended far beyond the physical presence of the executioner. Over time, execution practices evolved, influenced by shifts in law, religion, and philosophy. More humane or private executions gradually replaced public spectacles, and the role of torture and ordeal diminished. Nevertheless, the psychological, social, and cultural significance of public execution left an enduring mark on society. The legacy of these practices is visible in literature, folklore, and cultural memory, reminding us of the power of ritualized justice and the human fascination with fear, spectacle, and morality to reflecting on medieval execution methods. One can imagine the tension in the square, the murmuring crowd, the condemned awaiting their fate, the clatter of instruments, the tolling of bells, and the dramatic finality of death. Execution was both an end and a lesson, a profound demonstration of human authority, societal norms, and the inescapable consequences of transgression. Hanging, beheading, the wheel, and burning were more than acts of violence. They were expressions of social, moral, and spiritual order. They illustrated the intertwined nature of law, power, and human psychology in a world where obedience was demanded and fear was cultivated. For the medieval observer, the execution was a ritual, a story, and a warning, a visceral reminder that justice was ever present and absolute, As we continue through this documentary journey, we see that execution methods, like torture and ordeal, were reflections of the societal understanding of crime, morality, and divine will. They were at once terrifying, instructive, and mesmerizing, revealing the complex intersection of law, faith, and human experience. By studying these methods, we glimpse not only the brutality of the past, but also the cultural, psychological, and spiritual frameworks that shaped medieval justice. Chapter 11: Public Spectacle, the Role of the Crowd and Fear in Medieval Europe. Punishment was rarely a private matter. The law demanded visibility, and the theater of justice unfolded in public spaces where the entire community could bear witness. Town squares, castle courtyards, bridges, and crossroads became stages for moral instruction, social reinforcement, and the assertion of authority. Crime, punishment, and fear were intertwined, and the crowd played a central role in amplifying both the psychological and social impact of justice. The presence of witnesses transformed executions and other forms of punishment into a communal experience. Ensuring that lessons were internalized and stories spread, the spectacle of punishment was carefully orchestrated. Criminals were paraded through streets, sometimes mounted on carts, with signs displaying their crimes tied to their bodies. The procession was as much about humiliation as it was about transportation to the execution site. Onlookers crowded balconies, windows, and open spaces, watching as the offender approached the gallows, the pillory, or the stake. Every step of the journey communicated a narrative. Crime has consequences, law is inescapable, and fear is a tool for maintaining social order. Crowds were not passive observers. Their reactions were integral to the spectacle. Murmurs, cries, laughter, or jeers amplified the moral lesson and reinforced collective values. Public shaming, whipping, or exposure in the stocks drew attention to the offender and allowed society to participate in judgment. The crowd became an extension of authority, echoing the message that deviation from law and morality would not be tolerated. Social cohesion relied on the visibility of consequences, and witnessing punishment instilled both obedience and a shared understanding of societal norms. Children were present in these public displays, learning the rules of behavior and the consequences of disobedience from a young age. Their memories of the execution square would be formative, shaping concepts of justice, morality, and authority. Adolescents and adults alike absorbed the ritual, understanding that fear, shame, and awe were instruments used by the state to maintain order. In this way, public punishment functioned as an immersive educational tool, blending reality, performance, and societal expectation. Executions and punishments were staged with attention to psychological impact. The condemned might be subjected to final rituals, such as last prayers, confessions, or the recitation of crimes, reinforcing the narrative of justice. Executioners often displayed skill in their work, ensuring that the spectacle was both dramatic and instructive. The selection of the site, the timing of the event, and the positioning of the crowd were all deliberate, maximizing visibility and reinforcing the inescapability of law. Every element of the performance contributed to the shared cultural understanding that crime carried inevitable consequences. Public punishment also fostered a sense of community and collective morality. Witnessing the consequences of crime reinforced social bonds, reminding citizens of mutual obligations and shared values. In a world where personal safety, property, and hierarchy were constantly at risk, the spectacle of punishment offered reassurance that law and authority were actively engaged in maintaining order. It also satisfied a human fascination with fear, violence, and justice, offering a controlled and socially sanctioned outlet for emotion and curiosity. The emotional power of these spectacles was significant. Fear was a key instrument in maintaining obedience. Observing the suffering of the condemned reminded the audience that the law was tangible immediate, and absolute. Shame and humiliation reinforced moral conformity, while awe inspired reverence for authority. Pain and terror were not merely for the individual. They communicated the stakes to the entire community, ensuring that the consequences of disobedience were understood by all. Executioners and officials understood the role of drama and narrative in public punishment. The criminal's arrival, the rituals performed, the crowd's reactions, and the final act of justice were choreographed to maximize impact. Bells might toll, heralds announce the crime, and clergy offer last rites, blending the sacred and secular. The combination of ritual, spectacle, and physical punishment ensured that the community internalized the moral and legal lessons being presented. Fear was compounded by the unpredictability of medieval justice. Witnesses understood that anyone could be subjected to punishment for transgressions, no matter how minor. Arbitrary application, brutal efficiency, and the visibility of consequences made law both immediate and memorable. Communities internalized fear as a mechanism of control, shaping behavior even in the absence of direct enforcement. Observation alone became a deterrent, reinforcing moral and social order. Public executions also served as entertainment in a dark, ritualized sense. Crowds gathered for hours, watching and discussing the crimes, judgments, and outcomes. Food vendors, musicians, and town criers often accompanied these events, turning punishment into a social occasion. The line between education, enforcement, and spectacle blurred, reflecting human curiosity, fascination with violence, and desire to understand moral boundaries. The community was both audience and participant, absorbing lessons while engaging in a shared cultural experience. The impact of public punishment extended beyond the day of the execution. Stories, songs, and gossip spread the narrative of crime and justice to neighboring towns and villages. Written chronicles, legal records, and artistic depictions reinforced these lessons, ensuring that the memory of punishment persisted. This dissemination of knowledge contributed to social cohesion, as the consequences of transgression were remembered and transmitted, creating a broader framework of fear, respect, and compliance. Punishments were not limited to executions alone. Stocks, pillories, and public flogging were common methods for minor crimes. Even these forms of punishment relied on the crowd to amplify their effect. Individuals were displayed, humiliated, and subjected to ridicule, while spectators reinforced societal norms through laughter, mockery, and observation. Public shaming served as both deterrent and moral reinforcement, turning minor infractions into communal lessons in obedience. The role of the crowd was dynamic, shaping both the experience and interpretation of justice. Audiences might express sympathy, scorn, or approval, influencing perceptions of fairness and morality. Their presence turned punishment into a social contract, where the enforcement of law depended not only on the authorities but also on communal engagement. The interplay between executioners, the condemned, and witnesses created a living narrative of justice, morality, and societal values. Fear, spectacle, and morality intertwined in medieval public punishment. The lessons conveyed were profound, shaping behavior, internalizing norms, and reinforcing authority. Crime was not merely a private matter. It was a communal concern, observed, judged, and remembered by all. The physical and psychological effects of these events ensured that law and morality were visible, tangible, and unforgettable. Even as medieval justice evolved, the role of the crowd remained significant. Observation, memory, and social reinforcement continued to shape perceptions of crime and punishment. Public engagement transformed enforcement into education, spectacle, and moral instruction. Fear, awe, and fascination persisted as instruments of authority, ensuring that the lessons of history were passed from one generation to the next. As we imagine the crowded town square, the tension, the anticipation, and the mingling of horror and fascination. We see that public punishment was as much about social cohesion as individual justice. It reflected a world where community, morality, and authority were inseparable, and where witnessing the consequences of crime was an essential part of civic life. The crowd, with its collective presence, became an instrument of law, education, and fear, shaping the medieval psyche and leaving an enduring mark on cultural memory. The lessons of public spectacle remind us that crime and punishment were never merely personal matters. They were communal, ritualized, and performative, entwining human psychology, social norms, and authority in ways both subtle and dramatic. The town square, the gallows, the pillory, and the executioner's instruments all became tools of moral and legal education, ensuring that justice was experienced, remembered, and internalized by the entire community. Witnessing these events from a modern perspective, we gain insight not only into the methods of enforcement, but also into the societal values, fears, and collective psychology of the Middle Ages. The interplay of crime, punishment, and public participation created a complex tapestry of morality, fear, and authority, revealing a world where human behavior was guided as much by observation and social pressure as by law itself. Public executions were the ultimate fusion of law, morality, and spectacle. The crowd's presence amplified their impact, embedding lessons in memory and conscience. Fear, awe, and fascination coexisted, shaping the behavior of individuals and the cohesion of communities. In medieval Europe, justice was not only delivered, it was performed, witnessed, and remembered, a living drama that intertwined crime, punishment, and human experience. Chapter 12: Trial by Fire, Water, and Ordeal. Investigating guilt in the medieval world. The search for truth often took forms that seem extraordinary to us today. Justice was not always measured by evidence, witness testimony, or rational investigation. Sometimes it was determined by divine judgment. Trials by ordeal, fire, water, and combat were methods believed to reveal guilt or innocence through supernatural intervention. These trials were not merely tests. They were rituals steeped in religious belief, community participation, and social spectacle. They embodied the medieval conviction that God was the ultimate arbiter of justice, ensuring that even human fallibility could be overcome by divine will. The trial by fire was among the most dramatic of these methods. The accused might be required to carry a hot iron, hold a flame, or walk across glowing embers. The logic was simple yet deeply spiritual. If the individual emerged unscathed, God had declared them innocent. If injured, their guilt was revealed. To the medieval mind, this was an unassailable demonstration of divine judgment, removing doubt from the human administration of law. These trials were public, reinforcing faith, fear, and social cohesion. Onlookers watched with anticipation, understanding that divine favor or condemnation was visible in the physical outcome. Trial by water was another powerful method. Accused witches, heretics, or criminals might be subjected to immersion in water, often cold and unforgiving. The logic varied. Floating could indicate rejection by God, while sinking suggested innocence, though the practice was perilous. Communities witnessed the ordeal with a mixture of fascination and dread, aware that survival could signal divine approval or judgment. The physical suffering of the accused, combined with the ritualized nature of the test, reinforced the intertwining of morality, fear, and authority. Every splash, every gasp, became part of the story of justice, remembered long after the trial concluded. Trial by combat, or judicial duel, provided yet another lens into medieval justice. In cases where two parties disputed property, honor, or accusations, armed combat could determine the outcome. Knights, squires, and sometimes commoners fought under strict rules and the watchful eyes of judges, clergy, and the community. Victory was interpreted as divine sanction, while defeat confirmed guilt or dishonor. These duels were highly ceremonial, with weapons, armor, and the presence of witnesses emphasizing the gravity of the conflict. Like fire and water, combat was both a test and a spectacle, merging justice with martial skill, courage, and societal values. The rationale behind these ordeals rested on the profound belief that God would intervene to reveal truth. In a world where evidence could be scarce, witnesses unreliable, and corruption pervasive, divine judgment was considered the ultimate safeguard. Communities trusted these methods because they combined ritual, faith, and observation. The outcome, whether miraculous or tragic, was a tangible manifestation of justice, reinforcing social and spiritual hierarchies while deterring transgression, despite their perceived fairness. Trials by ordeal were often physically and psychologically taxing. Pain, fear, and risk of injury or death were central components. The accused endured intense suffering, sometimes for minor accusations or misunderstandings. Yet in a society where legal recourse was limited and authority absolute, these trials were seen as impartial and definitive. They provided closure, moral clarity, and a sense of divine legitimacy to decisions that might otherwise be contentious or ambiguous. The preparation and ritualization of ordeals were meticulous. Clergy, judges, and executioners coordinated each stage, ensuring that procedures adhered to tradition and reinforced legitimacy. Participants were often purged spiritually, praying and fasting to seek divine favor. The instruments of fire, water, or combat were prepared with care, the sites arranged for maximum visibility, and the audience positioned to witness the outcome. Every detail mattered, for the spectacle was a means of teaching, warning, and inspiring awe. Public engagement was crucial. Villagers, townspeople, and nobility gathered to witness ordeals, absorbing moral lessons and reinforcing communal values. The experience was both educational and cautionary, embedding principles of justice, obedience, and faith in the collective consciousness. Stories of miraculous survival, tragic injury, or divine intervention circulated widely, becoming part of oral history, local legend, and written chronicles. The spectacle of trial reinforced social norms as powerfully as the outcome itself. Not all ordeals relied on extreme physical challenge. Some were symbolic, using simple tests such as holding holy relics, swearing oaths, or undertaking penance. The underlying principle remained. Divine intervention revealed truth. These less perilous methods maintained the ritualistic and communal aspects of justice while mitigating physical harm, though fear and social pressure were no less potent. Even symbolic ordeals carried weight, demonstrating that crime and morality were inextricably linked to spiritual accountability. The psychological impact on communities was profound. Witnessing ordeals instilled a sense of cosmic order, reinforcing the belief that justice was not arbitrary but divinely sanctioned. Fear of crime, punishment, and spiritual consequence became internalized, guiding behavior and maintaining social stability. The presence of divine judgment alleviated some reliance on human discretion, which could be flawed or corrupt. Through ordeals, law and faith merged, providing a framework of morality, authority, and order that governed both individual and collective life. Trials by ordeal also reveal medieval attitudes toward evidence and truth. Whereas modern justice emphasizes documentation, investigation, and rationality, medieval law trusted divine insight to reveal what human senses might miss. Physical outcomes, burns, immersion, or victory in combat, served as tangible proof of abstract moral principles. Communities internalized these outcomes as demonstrations of ultimate justice, validating authority and reinforcing religious and social hierarchies. The consequences of failure were often severe. Injury, disfigurement, or death was a real risk, underscoring the gravity of accusations and the authority of the court. Survivors were transformed, acquitted by divine judgment. Their innocence was public, and their social standing reaffirmed. The ordeal became both a punishment for the innocent who feared suspicion and a vindication for those who endured. Whether by fire, water, or combat, the trials left indelible marks on participants, witnesses, and the cultural memory of communities. These methods also reflected broader societal fears. Witchcraft, heresy, and moral transgression were seen as existential threats. Trials by ordeal addressed these threats directly, combining physical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions to enforce compliance. Fear, ritual, and spectacle intertwined, creating a layered system of social control that resonated deeply with the medieval worldview. Every test communicated lessons about law, faith, and communal responsibility, while also demonstrating the omnipresence of divine and secular authority. The spectacle and ritual of trials also shaped perceptions of fairness and legitimacy. By framing outcomes as divinely guided, authorities reinforced the notion that justice was objective and impartial. Even when the accused suffered or perished, the process appeared righteous and morally coherent, maintaining trust in social and spiritual institutions. Communities absorbed these lessons, internalizing both the rules of conduct and the consequences of deviation, ensuring that fear and faith worked hand in hand to uphold order. Trials by ordeal gradually declined as legal systems evolved. Evidence standards improved, and skepticism about divine intervention grew. Yet their legacy remains a powerful window into medieval thought. They illuminate how societies interpreted morality, justice, and authority, how human fear and faith shaped behavior, and how spectacle and ritual reinforced social cohesion. Understanding these trials allows us to see the Middle Ages not as a simplistic era of cruelty, but as a complex society where law, religion, and psychology intertwined to maintain order and explain the unknown. The lessons of trial by fire, water, and combat remind us that justice is more than punishment. It is a reflection of societal values, beliefs, and fears. In medieval Europe, crime was never merely a personal act. It was a challenge to social, moral, and divine order. Ordeals provided a visible, ritualized, and communal means to resolve these challenges, demonstrating the power of faith and the authority of law. As we witness these practices from a modern perspective, the tension between justice, fear, and morality becomes apparent, revealing the intricate balance that governed medieval life. Through fire, water, and combat, the Middle Ages explored the boundaries of human courage, divine judgment, and societal expectations. Each trial was a story of risk, belief, and consequence, offering insights into the values, fears, and rituals that defined this world. In these ordeals, punishment and proof were inseparable from faith, and the community became both witness and participant in the enactment of justice. Chapter 13. Torture as Investigation. The search for confession and truth. In the medieval world, the pursuit of justice often walked hand in hand with fear and suffering. Beyond public executions and trials by ordeal, there existed a darker, more intimate method of revealing truth: torture. Far from arbitrary cruelty, torture was embedded in the legal and religious frameworks of the time. It was not only a tool for extracting confessions, but also a demonstration of authority, a ritualized practice designed to impress upon both the accused and the community the seriousness of crime, sin, and disobedience. Torture was used across Europe for centuries, justified by the belief that it could compel the guilty to speak and the innocent to reveal evidence that might otherwise remain hidden. Courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, relied on it in cases of theft, heresy, witchcraft, and political conspiracy. For medieval authorities, the human mind was deemed capable of concealing truth, yet the body could not escape divine and human scrutiny. Physical pain, carefully administered, was thought to strip away deception and reveal the core of guilt or innocence. The methods of torture varied widely, reflecting local custom, the severity of the alleged crime, and the creativity of the executioner. The rack, perhaps the most infamous device, stretched the body, dislocating joints and causing excruciating agony. The thumbscrew crushed fingers slowly, eliciting confessions through unbearable pressure. Iron chairs, with spikes pressing against the skin, and strappado, suspending the accused by the wrists, suspended between heaven and earth, created both terror and physical torment. These devices were not only tools, they were instruments of ritual, a physical language communicating the power of law and faith. Torture served multiple purposes. Its primary function was investigative, to compel confession or identify accomplices. Yet it also reinforced social order, creating public awareness of the consequences of crime. Witnesses, guards, and officials observed the process, understanding that transgression would not be tolerated. The spectacle of suffering combined with ritualized procedure made an indelible impression, ensuring that obedience was internalized by the wider community. Fear became a silent enforcer, operating as efficiently as any law or decree in ecclesiastical courts. Torture was closely tied to the notion of sin and divine judgment. Heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft were not simply crimes. They were violations against God. The use of physical coercion was framed as a spiritual necessity, intended to bring the soul back to truth and confession. The accused were often subjected to prayer, fasting, and admonition alongside physical punishment, creating an atmosphere where spiritual and corporeal torment intertwined. A confession, once extracted, carried profound moral and social weight, restoring order and reaffirming the authority of the Church. Medieval legal systems were surprisingly methodical in their use of torture. It was not indiscriminate. Procedures, limits, and rules often governed its application. The accused had to be formally charged, and torture was typically authorized by a judge or magistrate. Clergy or legal scholars sometimes supervised, ensuring that the process adhered to custom. The goal was not sadistic pleasure, but the extraction of information and confession. Nevertheless, the line between investigation and cruelty was often thin, and the psychological and physical suffering inflicted upon the accused could be immense. Psychological terror played a role as significant as physical pain. The anticipation of torture could break the mind long before the body endured it. Prisoners were often isolated, subjected to sleep deprivation, or made aware of the fates of previous victims. The instruments themselves, racks, wheels, iron cages, were as much symbols of authority as they were practical devices. To the observer, the sight of these instruments reinforced the omnipresence of law, while to the accused, they embodied the inevitability of exposure and punishment. Fear became a tool as powerful as pain itself. The ethical justification for torture was debated even in the Middle Ages. Legal theorists and clergy wrestled with the tension between coercion and divine judgment. Some argued that the body could suffer for the soul's salvation, that confession under duress, while extreme, served a higher moral purpose. Others cautioned against false confessions, emphasizing the risk of punishing the innocent. Yet, in practice, the system prioritized expediency, control, and authority, leaving little room for mercy or error. Torture was both practical and symbolic, a reflection of the medieval mind's intertwining of justice, morality, and fear. Torture also served investigative purposes beyond confession. Suspects might be pressed to name accomplices, reveal hidden evidence, or admit complicity in larger conspiracies. Criminal networks, political intrigues, and accusations of heresy were often complex, and authorities believed that only through suffering could hidden truths surface. The process was designed to be thorough, methodical, and terrifyingly effective, leaving no aspect of deception unexamined. Communities understood the stakes. Justice demanded truth, and truth required endurance. The social and cultural impact of torture was profound. Public awareness of the practice shaped behavior, reinforcing obedience and discouraging crime. Witnessing the suffering of others instilled caution, fear, and respect for authority. Oral tradition and chronicles recorded these events, spreading moral lessons across generations. Torture was not only punitive but educational, teaching lessons about law, morality, and divine oversight. Its reach extended beyond the individual, touching entire communities with the weight of fear and obedience. Medieval torture also had a symbolic dimension. It dramatized the power of authority, the fragility of the human body, and the omnipresence of divine judgment. Clergy, judges, and executioners participated in a ritual that merged law, faith, and spectacle. Pain became a visible measure of guilt, and confession a tangible manifestation of divine justice. Even when applied to physical criminals, the moral and spiritual dimensions of torture reinforced the worldview that crime was an affront not only to society, but to God Himself. Gender and social status played roles in the application of torture. Women accused of witchcraft or moral transgressions were particularly vulnerable, subjected to both physical and psychological torment designed to enforce conformity and obedience. Peasants, artisans, and lower-class individuals bore the brunt of inquisitorial procedures, while nobles and clergy often negotiated, bribed, or otherwise mitigated the effects. Torture, therefore, was not a universal equalizer but a reflection of societal hierarchies. Reinforcing both power and fear, the relationship between torture and confession also influenced legal documentation. Chronicles, court records, and clerical accounts often preserve confessions obtained under duress, creating a written history of crime, punishment, and authority. These documents, while informative, also raise questions about reliability, truth, and human suffering. They reveal a society struggling to reconcile justice, morality, and procedure within the limits of human knowledge and divine belief. Despite its brutality, torture was deeply ritualized. Timing, technique, and procedure were carefully prescribed. Executioners and clerics maintained standards to ensure that suffering remained controlled and purposeful. The combination of fear, spectacle, and procedural rigor created a system where the search for truth was inseparable from the experience of pain. Communities internalized these lessons, seeing in every confession a reaffirmation of law, morality, and social cohesion. Torture's decline began as legal reform. Rationalism and skepticism about divine intervention gained ground. By the late medieval and early modern periods, reliance on coercion decreased, replaced by more systematic investigation, witness testimony, and evidence-based adjudication. Yet the legacy of torture endures, offering insights into the fears, values, and structures of medieval society. Its study provides a window into a world where law, morality, and human suffering were deeply intertwined, and where the pursuit of truth often exacted the highest possible price. In understanding medieval torture, one sees not just cruelty, but a carefully constructed social mechanism. It reflected the fears of the time, the moral and spiritual framework, and the necessity of maintaining authority in a world without modern investigative tools. Torture shaped behavior, reinforced obedience, and demonstrated the consequences of crime, creating a cultural memory that resonates through history. As we reflect on these practices, it becomes clear that medieval justice was never merely punitive. It was a complex system of investigation, ritual, and control. Torture, though terrifying, was part of a broader framework seeking to uncover truth, maintain order, and enforce both moral and social norms. Its echoes remind us that the quest for justice has long been entwined with the interplay of fear, authority, and human vulnerability. Through the lens of torture, we glimpse a world where truth was sought not only through reason but through endurance, suffering, and the ever-present shadow of divine judgment. It was a world where crime was more than a legal matter. It was a challenge to morality, faith, and authority, a challenge that could only be answered through the harshest and most exacting means available. Chapter 14: Instruments of Pain, the Dark Science of Medieval Torture Devices. The Middle Ages were a time when authority and terror were inseparable, and nowhere was this more evident than in the instruments designed to extract confessions, punish transgressions, and maintain social order. Torture devices, meticulously engineered and psychologically potent, represented both human ingenuity and the darker impulses of medieval justice. They were as much about spectacle, symbolism, and control as they were about inflicting pain. Understanding these devices offers insight into a society deeply concerned with obedience, morality, and the absolute enforcement of law. Every medieval town, castle, and ecclesiastical court possessed its own repertoire of torture devices, adapted to local customs, the severity of crime, and available materials. Some were simple yet effective, such as the stocks or pillories, which restrained the body and subjected the individual to public humiliation. Others were complex and mechanical, like the rack, the iron chair, or the breaking wheel, designed to systematically crush, stretch, or maim. These devices were not born of random cruelty. They reflected a deliberate understanding of anatomy, pain thresholds, and human psychology, employed to ensure that confessions and obedience were extracted efficiently. The rack remains one of the most infamous instruments of medieval torment. A wooden frame with rollers at each end, it stretched the limbs of the accused until joints dislocated, muscles tore, and nerves screamed in agony. The rack was a calculated device. The tormentor could apply pressure gradually, prolonging pain to maximize both confession and intimidation. To witnesses, the rack was a visible representation of authority, demonstrating that no deceit could withstand the scrutiny of the law. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical suffering, with many confessing truthfully or falsely, under the weight of expectation and fear. Another prominent device was the iron chair, a terrifying invention designed to immobilize the body while inflicting acute pain. Constructed of iron and often studded with spikes, the chair punished those accused of moral or criminal transgressions. Victims were forced to sit upon it, sometimes with heat applied underneath, creating unbearable agony. Beyond physical torment, the iron chair symbolized the permanence of guilt. Its cold, unyielding surface left no doubt that law and morality demanded submission. The thumbscrew was another instrument of precision. By slowly crushing fingers or toes, it elicited confessions while inflicting extreme pain. Its simplicity belied its effectiveness. The victim could endure only so much before speaking, naming accomplices, or revealing hidden knowledge. The thumbscrew exemplifies the medieval understanding of leverage and pressure, demonstrating that even small, carefully applied force could have devastating consequences. Suspension devices, such as the strappato, combined physical pain with the terror of disorientation. Victims were hoisted by the wrists, often with weights attached to their feet, creating intense strain on shoulders and arms. This method not only caused excruciating pain, but also induced disorientation and fear of imminent death. The strappato was particularly effective when combined with interrogation, demonstrating the interplay between mental and physical torment in medieval justice. The breaking wheel, another infamous device, served both punitive and symbolic purposes. Criminals were bound to a large wheel, and their limbs were shattered with iron bars. The wheel was then displayed in a public space, leaving the victim to die slowly, their agony a lesson for all who witnessed. The breaking wheel was a statement of law and power, a chilling embodiment of the consequences of defiance. Its spectacle ensured that obedience was instilled not only in the condemned but in the broader community. Torture devices were also closely linked to notions of morality and divine justice. Devices like the pillory, while less physically destructive, inflicted shame and public scrutiny, turning punishment into a ritualized social lesson. Victims were exposed to the gaze of the community, pelted with refuse, jeered at, and forced to endure humiliation. Here, the instrument served a dual purpose. It punished the individual and reinforced collective moral norms, ensuring that all members of society internalized the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The ingenuity of medieval torture extended beyond mechanical devices. The rack of unknown design, the water-based torments, and heat instruments demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and the limits of endurance. Pain was not applied randomly, but carefully measured, escalating until the desired confession or compliance was achieved. Executioners were skilled in balancing suffering with survival, ensuring that victims could endure long enough to reveal secrets or comply with authority. Medieval inventors often customized devices to suit the crime or the social status of the accused. Nobles might be subjected to less brutal forms, such as public shaming or restraint, while commoners endured harsher, more physically destructive torments. Gender also played a role, with women accused of witchcraft or sexual transgressions sometimes subjected to devices designed to inflict both physical and psychological pain, reflecting societal anxieties about power, morality, and control. The use of water as torture, including methods such as waterboarding or forced immersion, created a psychological torment that complemented physical suffering. The sensation of drowning, combined with immobilization and fear, induced panic and despair. Water torture was often employed to extract confessions of heresy, witchcraft, or treason, revealing the medieval mindset that intertwined physical, spiritual, and psychological dimensions of punishment. Medieval torture devices were also accompanied by ritualized procedure. Guards, clerics, and magistrates often oversaw the process, ensuring that it adhered to established norms. Victims might be stripped, bound, and placed in specific positions, with instruments applied in a systematic manner. These procedures reinforced the legitimacy of the act, framing it as necessary, orderly, and justified within the moral and legal frameworks of the time. The ritualized nature of torture elevated it from mere cruelty to an instrument of authority, morality, and law. Public perception was central to the use of torture devices. Townsfolk, merchants, and peasants observed, often from a distance, the administration of pain. The devices served as warnings, teaching lessons about obedience, morality, and divine oversight. Chroniclers documented the events meticulously, embedding these instruments into the historical record as both tools of enforcement and symbols of societal values. Stories of torture devices traveled across regions, shaping collective memory and reinforcing the omnipresence of law and faith. The ethical debates surrounding torture were ongoing, even in medieval times. Some legal theorists and clergy questioned the morality of inflicting extreme suffering, emphasizing fairness, evidence, and spiritual consequences. Others defended the practice, citing the necessity of maintaining social order, uncovering truth, and deterring crime. These debates highlight a society grappling with the tension between justice, authority, and human suffering, and they demonstrate that even amid brutality, reflection and moral reasoning were present. The decline of these instruments began gradually. As the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modern legal reforms challenged their necessity and morality. Skepticism about divine authority, the rise of evidence-based law, and concerns for human dignity led to the gradual abandonment of mechanical and ritualized torture. Yet the legacy of these instruments endures in cultural memory, literature, and historical study, providing a window into the fears, values, and mechanisms of medieval society. Medieval torture devices were more than tools, they were symbols. They reflected a worldview in which crime was a profound threat to both social order and divine will. Pain became a language, authority a visible force, and obedience a product of fear and ritual. By studying these instruments, we understand not only the mechanics of medieval justice but the psychology, culture, and morality that shaped an entire era. The instruments themselves, often displayed in museums or illustrated in chronicles, remain haunting reminders of a world where law, morality, and fear intertwined. Each spike, lever, and chain tells a story of human ingenuity applied to the enforcement of justice, a story that balances awe, horror, and the relentless pursuit of control. As we continue this exploration, it is clear that medieval torture devices were central to a system that sought to balance fear, order, and morality. They were designed not only to punish but to educate, enforce authority, and communicate the consequences of transgression. The dark science behind them illuminates a society both ingenious and brutal, revealing the lengths to which humans have gone to maintain order and ensure compliance. In contemplating these instruments, we witness the careful calculation, ritual, and psychological strategy embedded in medieval punishment. Pain was a tool, fear was a weapon, and justice was both visible and omnipresent. These devices, horrifying in function yet fascinating in design, stand as enduring symbols of an age when law, morality, and human suffering were inextricably intertwined. Chapter 15: The Spectacle of Pain, Public Torture as Entertainment, and Warning. In the Middle Ages, punishment was never solely a private matter. Crime and justice were profoundly public, a performance staged in town squares, marketplaces, and castle courtyards for all to witness. Public torture served multiple functions. It punished the guilty, warned the community, reinforced authority, and, perhaps surprisingly, entertained. Spectacle was central to medieval justice. The suffering of a criminal was a visible demonstration of law, morality, and divine authority, and it was presented in ways that could captivate, horrify, and instruct simultaneously. The medieval populace was accustomed to public displays. Markets, fairs, and festivals brought communities together, and the same spaces were used for executing justice. When a criminal was brought before the crowd, the scene was meticulously organized. Executioners, guards, and magistrates ensured that the ritual unfolded according to procedure. Victims were often paraded through the streets, bound or chained, before being displayed in stocks, pillories, or other devices. This procession served as both humiliation and theater, signaling to all that the law was absolute and inescapable. Crowds gathered in anticipation, drawn by curiosity, fear, and the thrill of witnessing justice enacted. The psychological impact on both the spectators and the accused was profound. The criminal became a living lesson, their body a canvas upon which authority, morality, and consequence were vividly painted. Townspeople watched closely, noting the crimes, the instruments, and the punishments, internalizing the social norms and boundaries that governed their lives. The spectacle of pain was a form of civic education, reinforcing obedience through observation. Public torture was carefully calibrated. Executioners were skilled professionals, trained to inflict maximal fear and pain while maintaining control over the proceedings. The sequence of events, the instruments used, and the duration of punishment were all calculated. For example, a pillory might hold a petty thief for hours or days, subjected to ridicule, mockery, and physical discomfort. Crowds were encouraged to participate by throwing rotten vegetables, jeering, or mocking the condemned, integrating communal participation into the process. This participatory element reinforced societal cohesion, aligning collective sentiment with law and morality. Spectacle was particularly evident in executions involving mechanical torture devices, such as the rack, iron chair, or breaking wheel. These instruments were displayed prominently, emphasizing their design and purpose. Victims were subjected to physical torment in view of all, the sounds of agony echoing through streets and squares. Chroniclers often noted the reactions of onlookers, recording astonishment, horror, and sometimes fascination. The theatricality of the event underscored the omnipresence of law and the consequences of defiance. The public nature of torture also served as deterrence. Medieval society lacked modern policing and rapid communication, so making examples of criminals was essential to maintaining order. Witnessing the consequences of theft, murder, or heresy was intended to dissuade others from similar transgressions. The more dramatic and memorable the punishment, the stronger the warning. The visual and auditory impact of suffering, combined with the social shame inflicted on the condemned, created an enduring lesson for the community. Religious symbolism frequently accompanied public punishment. Clerics often presided over executions, offering prayers, admonitions, and explanations of divine justice. The suffering of the criminal was framed as both worldly punishment and spiritual purification. For heretics, witches, and blasphemers, the public display emphasized the intersection of human law and divine judgment. Townspeople were reminded that crime was not only a social violation but a transgression against God, reinforcing the moral and spiritual dimensions of obedience. The spectacle of pain also reflected societal hierarchies. Nobles, clergy, and high-ranking officials were often spared the most humiliating or physically destructive punishments, facing fines, exile, or symbolic penalties instead. Commoners, peasants, and marginalized individuals endured harsher, more visible penalties, highlighting the inequality inherent in medieval justice. Public punishment reinforced social stratification, reminding all that authority, status, and obedience were deeply entwined. The sensory experience of public torture was intense. Visual, auditory, and olfactory elements combined to create a lasting impression. The sight of chains, spikes, and dismembered limbs. The sounds of screams, cries, and bells. The smell of blood, smoke, and decay, all contributed to a multisensory lesson in the consequences of crime. Chroniclers, artists, and storytellers documented these events, embedding them in cultural memory. Stories of notorious executions spread quickly, circulating fear, fascination, and caution throughout towns and regions. Communities developed rituals around public torture. Fairs and market days might coincide with executions, ensuring maximum attendance. Clerics delivered sermons emphasizing morality, sin, and the dangers of disobedience. Town criers announced punishments in advance, creating anticipation and reinforcing communal awareness. Executioners, often respected professionals, performed their roles with precision, understanding the power of spectacle in maintaining law and order. The entire event was orchestrated as a form of social theater, blending justice, morality, and drama. Torture and public punishment were also instruments of political power. Monarchs, lords, and local authorities used spectacle to demonstrate their authority and deter rebellion. Political enemies, traitors, and dissenters were subjected to public torment, sending a clear message to rivals and subjects alike. The public display of power reinforced loyalty, minimized resistance, and established a culture of fear in which authority was visibly reinforced through suffering, despite the brutality. Public executions had complex social functions. They provided a space for communal catharsis, allowing townspeople to confront fears, reaffirm moral codes, and participate in a shared experience of justice. The crowd, while observing, became an active participant in enforcing social norms. Mockery, jeering, and involvement in the ritualized humiliation fostered a sense of collective moral alignment, uniting communities through shared values and experiences that as the Middle Ages progressed, the nature of public torture evolved. Instruments became more specialized, rituals more codified, and chroniclers more meticulous in recording the events. Some executions incorporated elaborate stages, banners, and speeches, transforming punishment into an almost ceremonial affair. The line between justice and theater became increasingly blurred, illustrating the medieval understanding of law as both practical enforcement and performative display. Gender and social status continued to shape experiences of public punishment. Women accused of moral crimes, witchcraft, or heresy often faced uniquely tailored forms of torment designed to emphasize shame and vulnerability. Men accused of theft, rebellion, or murder encountered more physically destructive devices. Across all cases, the public nature of punishment amplified its psychological and social impact, reinforcing hierarchies and moral expectations. Chroniclers, poets, and artists contributed to the enduring memory of public torture. Illuminated manuscripts depicted instruments, processions, and executions with meticulous detail. Stories circulated through oral tradition, influencing perceptions of justice, crime, and morality for generations. These narratives blended fact and exaggeration, creating a cultural understanding in which punishment was both cautionary tale and historical spectacle. Public torture also reflected the psychological dimensions of medieval justice. Authorities understood that fear, humiliation, and anticipation were as effective as physical suffering in maintaining order. The spectacle communicated the reach and permanence of authority, instilled obedience, and reinforced the intertwining of social, moral, and spiritual norms. Witnessing an execution or torture session was a lesson in law, morality, and the consequences of disobedience, etched indelibly into memory to be why examining these events. We gain insight into the mindset of medieval society. Law was inseparable from morality, punishment inseparable from spectacle, and justice inseparable from authority. The public display of pain was a powerful tool, simultaneously educational, deterrent, and performative. It reinforced societal cohesion while instilling fear, a delicate balance that defined medieval communities. The legacy of public torture persists in modern consciousness. Historical accounts, preserved instruments, and artistic depictions provide a window into an era when justice was a communal, visible, and theatrical act. They reveal a society in which pain, fear, and morality were intertwined, and in which every act of punishment communicated authority, reinforced norms, and told a story of human behavior and societal expectations. As we continue our exploration of medieval punishment, it becomes clear that public torture was more than a method of enforcing law. It was a carefully constructed system of social control. Through spectacle, authorities communicated power, instilled fear, and reinforced moral codes, creating a society in which obedience was achieved not only through law but through the vivid demonstration of consequences. The echoes of these public spectacles resonate through history, offering insight into the human desire for justice, order, and social cohesion. Chapter 16, From Trial to Execution. The legal path to death. In medieval Europe, the act of taking a life was never arbitrary. Death, as the ultimate punishment, followed a structured and highly ritualized legal path. Though today we may view executions as barbaric, in the context of the Middle Ages, they were the culmination of a formalized system designed to enforce law, morality, and social order. Every hanging, beheading, or burning began not with the blade or rope, but with the court, where human actions, intentions, and guilt were meticulously examined under the watchful eyes of authorities, witnesses, and often the public. The legal process began with accusation. Crime was often discovered through observation, rumor, or testimony, and accusations could emerge from a variety of sources: neighbors reporting theft, merchants noting missing goods, or clergy documenting heretical behavior. Sometimes accusations were genuine, sometimes motivated by envy, political gain, or personal vendetta. Regardless of origin, a claim against a person initiated a process in which social, moral, and legal codes intertwined. Authorities could range from local lords and city magistrates to bishops and royal justices, depending on the nature of the crime and the status of the accused. Once an accusation was made, an investigation commenced. In towns and villages, local officials such as bailiffs, sheriffs, or elders gathered testimony from witnesses, inspected evidence, and interrogated the accused. In cases involving significant crimes or high-status individuals, matters could escalate to royal or ecclesiastical courts. Clergy often played a dual role as moral adjudicators and legal arbiters, particularly in cases involving heresy, blasphemy, or moral transgressions. Their authority extended to both spiritual and temporal matters, intertwining divine and human judgment in ways that reinforced societal hierarchies and obedience. The trial itself was a complex ritual. Procedures varied across regions and periods, but certain elements were consistent. The accused was summoned before a panel of judges, often in the presence of witnesses, jurors, or the public. Evidence was presented, testimony recorded, and confessions elicited. The methods of obtaining confessions were sometimes coercive. Torture, sanctioned by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities, could be used to extract truth. Devices like the rack, thumbscrews, or the iron chair were designed not only to inflict pain but to break the will of the accused, compelling them to admit guilt. While such measures are horrifying to modern sensibilities, they were understood at the time as legitimate instruments of justice. Evidence was a combination of material proof, witness testimony, and, in some cases, divine judgment. In the absence of forensic science, trial by ordeal was a common method for determining guilt. Ordeals by fire, water, or combat tested the accused's innocence through divine intervention. If a hand burned or a body sank, it was interpreted as proof of guilt. These trials reflected the medieval belief that God actively participated in human justice, guiding the outcome through supernatural signs. Though often brutal and arbitrary, ordeals were taken seriously, with outcomes respected by both authorities and communities. Legal advocacy, though limited, played a role. Some accused individuals had access to counsel, usually through family, guilds, or local supporters. Wealth, status, and connections could influence proceedings, sometimes allowing the accused to avoid death or secure more lenient punishments. Conversely, commoners and marginalized individuals faced a system heavily weighted against them, where poverty and lack of influence could condemn them regardless of actual guilt. The law, while structured, was inseparable from social hierarchy and political power. Once a verdict was reached, sentencing followed. Death sentences were pronounced with formal ceremony, emphasizing the authority of the court and the inevitability of consequence. Judges often delivered the sentence in public, highlighting the gravity of crime and the moral order that society sought to preserve. Execution dates were set, and preparations began, from constructing gallows and scaffolds to assembling executioners and informing local communities. The announcement of an impending execution served both practical and psychological purposes. It ensured order, discouraged flight, and heightened the communal awareness of justice in action. Executioners were specialized professionals, trained in the technical and ritualistic aspects of their work. They were responsible for maintaining the dignity of the law while carrying out its harshest punishments. Beheadings required precision to ensure a swift death, while hangings demanded careful calculation to guarantee an effective drop. In the case of burnings, gallows or stakes were arranged to ensure visibility and symbolic resonance. Executioners became central figures in the legal process, embodying both fear and authority, and their role was respected even as their work horrified observers. The day of execution was a carefully orchestrated spectacle. Townspeople gathered early, lining streets, squares, and vantage points. Bells tolled, drums beat, and proclamations announced the presence of law and order. Clergy often accompanied the procession, offering prayers, last rites, or admonitions. The condemned might be allowed final words or confessions, emphasizing the intersection of spiritual and temporal judgment. Public observation was critical. The execution was a lesson, a warning, and a reaffirmation of societal norms. The community witnessed the consequences of crime, internalizing the moral and legal order enforced through human and divine authority. Methods of execution were varied and symbolic. Hanging was common for theft and murder, emphasizing the gravity of violating social order. Beheading, often reserved for nobles, combined efficiency with ceremony. Burning at the stake was reserved for heresy, witchcraft, and other offenses seen as defiance of divine law, reinforcing both physical and spiritual consequences. The breaking wheel, drawing and quartering, or other torturous methods reflected both deterrent function and the medieval appetite for symbolic justice. Each method communicated specific societal messages, linking the act of punishment to the broader moral and political context. Execution also served psychological and social functions. It reinforced authority, validated the court's decisions, and provided communal catharsis. Witnessing the death of a criminal allowed townspeople to confront fears, reaffirm norms, and participate in a shared moral experience. The combination of ritual, observation, and suffering created a collective understanding of justice, morality, and consequence, cementing the execution as both a legal and social institution. Religious elements were intertwined with the legal and ritualistic process. Clergy offered last rites, urged repentance, and interpreted the execution as both human and divine justice. For heretics, witches, and blasphemers, the act of execution symbolized the triumph of divine order over human defiance. In this context, the execution was not simply punishment, but also purification, a demonstration of God's authority working through human institutions. The path from trial to execution also reflected the complexity and bureaucracy of medieval law. Documentation, witness statements, records of confessions, and sentencing decrees were meticulously kept, forming archives that survive to this day. These records offer invaluable insight into legal reasoning, procedural norms, and societal attitudes toward crime and punishment. They reveal not only the mechanisms of justice, but also the interplay between authority, morality, and public perception. Ultimately, the legal path to death in the Middle Ages was a journey through a society deeply concerned with order, morality, and authority. Accusation, investigation, trial, sentencing, and execution were components of a system designed to maintain stability, deter crime, and assert the interconnected power of kings, lords, and the church. The process, while often harsh and unforgiving, reflected a worldview in which justice was inseparable from social hierarchy, morality, and divine oversight. As we move forward into subsequent chapters, it becomes clear that execution was the culmination of a sophisticated legal framework, one that intertwined fear, ceremony, and authority. Understanding the legal path to death provides essential context for exploring the instruments, rituals, and social dynamics that define medieval punishment. Each step, from accusation to final breath, illuminates a world in which law, morality, and power were inseparable, and in which the shadow of justice was always present. Chapter 17: Women, Crime, and Punishment. Gendered justice in the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, the world of crime and punishment was not experienced equally by all. Women occupied a complex and often vulnerable position within society, and their encounters with the law were shaped by gendered expectations, social roles, and cultural fears. From accusations of theft and adultery to charges of witchcraft and heresy, women's crimes were often framed in relation to morality, domesticity, and perceived spiritual weakness. To understand the experiences of women in the criminal justice system, we must first understand the societal framework that defined their lives. Medieval society was patriarchal, hierarchical, and deeply intertwined with religious doctrine. A woman's behavior was closely monitored by family, neighbors, and the church. Expectations of obedience, chastity, and domestic responsibility were rigid, and transgression was met with scrutiny and sometimes severe punishment. Even minor offenses, such as gossip, petty theft, or failure to fulfill domestic duties, could lead to social condemnation. The law, while ostensibly neutral, often reflected these cultural biases, ensuring that women's actions were interpreted through the lens of gendered norms. Accusations against women were frequently rooted in suspicion of moral or spiritual failings. Adultery, for example, was considered a crime not only against the aggrieved spouse but against societal and divine order. Punishments for such offenses were public and humiliating. Women might be forced to wear identifying symbols, such as a scarlet letter or a placard, and participate in public penance. Stocks and pillories were commonly employed to display the transgressor, subjecting her to ridicule, scorn, and sometimes physical abuse from onlookers. The spectacle reinforced both moral expectations and the authority of the law, reminding communities of the consequences of defiance. Witchcraft represented one of the most extreme intersections of gender and crime. Women, particularly those who were older, unmarried, or living on the margins of society, were disproportionately accused of practicing magic or consorting with the devil. Such accusations were often fueled by fear, superstition, or personal animosity. In rural communities, where misfortune, illness, or crop failure demanded explanation, women could easily become scapegoats. Trials for witchcraft were conducted with ritualistic rigor, combining ecclesiastical authority, secular law, and public spectacle. Evidence ranged from confessions, often coerced under torture, to eyewitness accounts of mysterious behavior or alleged supernatural acts. Punishments were severe, ranging from imprisonment and mutilation to execution by burning. Intended to purify both the individual and the community, the influence of the church in shaping gender justice cannot be overstated. Clergy were instrumental in defining what constituted female transgression, particularly in cases of sexual or spiritual misconduct. Heresy, blasphemy, and moral failings were framed as offenses not only against God, but against the natural social hierarchy, in which women were expected to embody piety, obedience, and virtue. Ecclesiastical courts exercised jurisdiction over many crimes committed by women, emphasizing confession, penance, and spiritual correction alongside secular punishment. The intertwining of moral, legal, and religious authority ensured that women's transgressions were scrutinized and punished with particular intensity. Domestic and property crimes also carried gendered implications. Women involved in theft, fraud, or disputes over land or dowry were often treated more harshly if their actions were perceived as violating social norms. A peasant woman caught stealing grain to feed her family might face the same penalties as a male thief, but accusations could be compounded by suspicions of moral weakness or spiritual corruption. In wealthier households, disputes over dowries, inheritance, or financial management sometimes led to charges of fraud or deception, highlighting how women's legal vulnerabilities were shaped by both social position and gendered expectations. Punishments for women were frequently designed to humiliate as well as to penalize. Public shaming, forced labor, and exposure to community scorn were common. In cases of adultery or sexual misconduct, women might be paraded through town, whipped, or otherwise physically punished. These spectacles were intended to communicate moral and social lessons, ensuring that others internalized the consequences of violating gendered norms. The emphasis on visibility, ritual, and community involvement reflected the broader medieval philosophy that law and morality were inseparable, and that punishment served both practical and symbolic purposes. Sexual violence and coercion were often overlooked or minimized in legal proceedings, reflecting a stark imbalance in justice. Women were vulnerable not only to accusations, but also to abuse by those in positions of authority. A nobleman or local official might exploit their power to commit acts of violence or coercion with limited consequences, while women attempting to defend themselves faced significant risk. This imbalance reinforced patriarchal structures and shaped the lived experiences of women in ways that extended beyond formal legal records, creating a shadow history of fear, oppression, and resilience. Pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood also intersected with the legal system in complex ways. Infanticide, often born of desperation or social pressure, was a serious crime punishable by death. Yet courts sometimes considered circumstances, including the woman's age, social status, and the pressures imposed by family or community. Similarly, accusations of neglect or endangerment could arise from disputes over childcare or domestic responsibilities. These cases underscored the ways in which women's bodies and roles were closely monitored and controlled within both familial and societal structures that in some regions. Women found ways to navigate, manipulate, or resist the legal system. Connections through family, guilds, or religious institutions could provide protection or mitigation. Women might use advocacy, negotiation, or appeal to ecclesiastical authorities to reduce punishment or secure more favorable outcomes. These strategies highlight the agency that some women could exercise, even within a system largely designed to limit their autonomy. Nevertheless, such interventions were exceptions, dependent on social status, influence, and access to networks of power. The intersection of superstition, religion, and legal authority created an environment in which women were especially susceptible to accusations of malevolent intent or moral failure. The fear of witchcraft, heresy, or sexual transgression loomed large, and even ordinary behavior could be interpreted as threatening or deviant. Punishment served not only to correct individual behavior, but to reaffirm social hierarchies and maintain communal order. In this way, gender justice reflected broader cultural anxieties and social dynamics, reinforcing the patriarchal structures that defined medieval life. Throughout the Middle Ages, executions of women were often designed to be highly symbolic. Women accused of heresy, witchcraft, or infanticide were sometimes executed publicly to serve as cautionary examples, with the rituals surrounding their deaths emphasizing the moral and spiritual dimensions of crime. Burning, hanging, or beheading were accompanied by sermons, prayers, and communal witnessing, ensuring that the act of punishment reinforced both legal and religious authority. These executions were as much about maintaining social and moral order as they were about punishing the individual. Despite these challenges, Medieval women were not merely passive victims of the justice system. They acted as witnesses, informants, advocates, and sometimes perpetrators, navigating a world in which power, fear, and survival intersected in complex ways. Their stories, preserved in legal records, chronicles, and folklore, reveal resilience, agency, and humanity within a system often characterized by oppression and violence. Through careful study, we can glimpse the strategies, struggles, and lived experiences of women in a society where law and morality were deeply intertwined, and where gender shaped every step of the journey from accusation to punishment. In examining the gendered dimensions of medieval crime and punishment, it becomes clear that justice was never applied equally. Women faced heightened scrutiny, socially imposed constraints, and punishments designed to reinforce gendered norms. Yet their responses, whether through compliance, negotiation, or resistance, illustrate the nuanced ways in which individuals engaged with the law. Understanding these dynamics enriches our comprehension of medieval society and highlights the human dimension behind historical legal systems. As we move forward, the exploration of women's roles in medieval justice reminds us that the past is layered, complex, and deeply human. Crime, punishment, and societal control were experienced differently depending on gender, status, and circumstance. By tracing these experiences, we gain insight into the cultural, moral, and legal structures that defined medieval life, and into the resilience of those who navigated its challenges with courage, intelligence, and humanity. Chapter 19. The Role of Spectators, Community, Curiosity, and Morality. In medieval Europe, public executions were not only events of punishment, but also powerful social rituals, with spectators playing a central role. The community's presence transformed an act of judicial enforcement into a collective experience, blending curiosity, morality, and civic education. The witness became as important as the condemned, for it was through the eyes of the audience that the lessons of law, faith, and obedience were reinforced. To truly understand the dynamics of medieval execution, one must explore the psychology, behavior, and influence of the crowds who watched, judged, and internalized these grim spectacles. From the early hours of the day, townspeople would gather near the scaffold, gallows, or designated execution site. Bells tolled from churches and town halls, announcing the impending punishment and drawing attention from miles around. Merchants, laborers, peasants, and nobility all made their way to witness the event, each motivated by different impulses. For some, the spectacle was a form of entertainment. For others, it was a moral lesson. And for many, it was an opportunity to participate in the communal enforcement of social norms. Execution Day disrupted the ordinary rhythm of life, transforming marketplaces, streets, and squares into stages for the theater of justice. Curiosity was a dominant human impulse in the audience. News of a trial or impending execution spread rapidly, often with exaggerations and rumors amplifying the drama. Spectators arrived eager to witness the final moments, to see the accused, and to satisfy an innate fascination with life, death, and the power of authority. This fascination was not mere voyeurism. It was entwined with education and morality. Observing the punishment of wrongdoers reinforced the societal hierarchy, illustrating the consequences of transgression and the reach of justice. The executioner, the clergy, and the officials became actors in a moral narrative, guiding the audience's interpretation of right and wrong. The social diversity of the crowd created a complex dynamic. Nobles and officials might observe with an analytical eye, noting procedural details, political implications, or potential lessons for governance. Merchants and artisans saw examples of economic or moral transgressions, understanding the risks of dishonesty, theft, or disobedience. Peasants and laborers witnessed the consequences of rebellion, theft, or heresy, internalizing lessons about submission, community, and survival. Even children, often brought along by parents, were educated through these vivid experiences, learning societal norms and the limits of acceptable behavior in a way no classroom could provide. Spectators were not passive. Their reactions influenced the performance of the execution itself. Cheers, jeers, prayers, and gasps shaped the tone, pace, and intensity of the event. Executioners adjusted their actions based on crowd behavior. Clerics delivered sermons aimed at eliciting reflection, and officials ensured the spectacle adhered to moral and legal expectations. In this way, the audience participated in a form of civic theater, reinforcing communal values and ensuring that justice was not only done but seen to be done. The interplay between performers and observers created a feedback loop in which punishment became both instruction and entertainment. Moral reflection was a crucial aspect of the spectator experience. Clergy often provided commentary, interpreting the crime and punishment as a spiritual lesson. Sermons emphasized sin, repentance, and divine judgment, framing the execution as more than a civic matter. It was a religious event. Spectators were reminded that transgressions disrupted not only human order, but also the divine plan. The public nature of punishment transformed private guilt into communal understanding, ensuring that lessons of morality, obedience, and piety were widely disseminated. In observing the condemned, the audience confronted both fear and conscience, internalizing rules and social norms. Executions also functioned as a tool for social cohesion. The act of gathering together, collectively witnessing punishment, reinforced a shared understanding of law, morality, and order. It created a sense of belonging, reminding individuals of their roles within the community. In a world where communication was limited and social control fragile, the spectacle of execution served as a powerful communal lesson. Everyone, from the lowest peasant to the most influential noble, was reminded that justice was omnipresent and that adherence to societal rules was essential for survival. Curiosity and fear often blended in complex ways. Many spectators approached the scaffold with a mixture of dread and fascination. The human mind was captivated by the uncertainty of the condemned's fate, the tension of final moments, and the ritualized procedures that framed death. Fear reinforced obedience. Witnessing the punishment of others served as a visceral reminder of what might occur if one strayed from law, faith, or social norms. In this way, executions were a psychological tool, shaping behavior through communal observation and emotional resonance. The presence of children added another layer of significance. Young observers absorbed lessons about morality, hierarchy, and consequence in a direct, memorable way. Execution Day became an educational, though grim, rite of passage, imparting lessons of caution, respect for authority, and awareness of the dangers of wrongdoing. For adults, these events reinforced social rules, strengthened communal bonds, and confirmed the legitimacy of governing authorities. The act of witnessing was thus both personal and collective, embedding lessons deeply into the cultural consciousness. Spectators were also storytellers. Accounts of executions spread through markets, taverns, and homes, transforming individual events into collective memory. Chroniclers, scribes, and artists often recorded executions, emphasizing dramatic or moral elements, sometimes exaggerating details to highlight lessons. These stories reinforced social norms across regions and generations. Even those who had not witnessed the event directly became aware of its moral and social significance through oral and written transmission, ensuring the execution's impact extended far beyond the immediate audience. The reactions of the crowd could influence future legal and civic practices. Public approval, outrage, or indifference shaped the conduct of authorities, informing decisions about timing, method, or spectacle. Execution was thus a dialogue between the state, the church, and the community, mediated by the presence and interpretation of witnesses. The audience held a subtle yet significant power, ensuring that the lessons of justice were not abstract but grounded in lived experience. The spectacle of execution also reinforced social hierarchies. Nobility often witnessed or participated in ceremonies from reserved areas, emphasizing their status and control. Commoners were placed in open spaces, absorbing lessons of obedience and conformity. Even among the condemned, status affected treatment, method of execution, and degree of public humiliation. Through the lens of the audience, the social order was dramatized and reaffirmed, demonstrating the consequences of crossing established boundaries. The cultural and psychological dimensions of execution highlight the complex role of spectators in medieval society. They were not mere observers. They were participants in a shared moral and civic experience. Their presence legitimized authority, reinforced norms, and transformed punishment into both instruction and ritual. Through observation, reflection, and storytelling, spectators became conduits for societal values, ensuring that the lessons of justice, morality, and obedience were transmitted across time and space. In conclusion, the role of spectators in medieval executions extended far beyond passive observation. They were essential to the performance, interpretation, and social function of punishment. The interplay between curiosity, fear, moral reflection, and communal participation made Execution Day a pivotal event in the life of the community. By observing, internalizing, and recounting these events, spectators helped maintain order, reinforce authority, and embed lessons of justice and morality into the cultural consciousness. Their presence ensured that crime and punishment were not isolated acts, but shared experiences that shaped the very fabric of medieval society. Chapter 20: Legacy of Public Executions, Memory, Culture, and Morality. Public executions in the Middle Ages were more than instruments of justice. They were cultural events, shaping communal memory, social norms, and moral frameworks for generations. The hangman's scaffold, the gallows, and the stake became more than places of punishment. They were stages upon which the lessons of law, faith, and social order were dramatized for all to witness. Though centuries have passed since these rituals dominated medieval life, their echoes remain, influencing literature, art, philosophy, and our understanding of justice. To fully comprehend the legacy of these grim spectacles, one must consider their social, moral, and cultural impact across time. In the immediate sense, public executions functioned as education. Communities internalized lessons about obedience, authority, and morality through observation. Crime and transgression were not abstract concepts. They were embodied in the visible suffering of those who broke the law. For medieval spectators, these events served as cautionary tales, embedding the consequences of wrongdoing into the collective consciousness. Parents guided children's understanding of justice, clergy reinforced spiritual teachings, and officials ensured that civic order was maintained. The experience was holistic, blending social, moral, and religious instruction into a single, memorable spectacle. Storytelling was central to the legacy of executions. Eyewitnesses, chroniclers, and later historians recorded the events in vivid detail, often emphasizing moral lessons, the courage or cowardice of the condemned, and the authority of the rulers who enacted justice. These narratives transformed individual punishments into enduring cultural artifacts. Accounts of dramatic executions, torture, and martyrdom circulated through towns, shaping collective memory and influencing public perception of both criminals and authorities. Over time, the stories evolved, blending fact and legend. and serving as a repository of societal values, fears, and expectations. Artistic representation played a significant role in preserving the memory of executions. Illuminated manuscripts, woodcuts, and paintings depicted scenes of public punishment, emphasizing either moral instruction or the spectacle itself. Artists captured not only the act of execution, but also the reactions of the crowd, the solemnity of clergy, and the authority of rulers. These visual records reinforced lessons about obedience, faith, and civic responsibility while preserving the emotional resonance of the events for generations. Through art, the experience of execution was transformed from a temporal event into a lasting symbol of law, order, and morality. The influence of public executions extended into literature, philosophy, and political thought. Stories of heroism, villainy, and divine justice informed both fictional and historical narratives, shaping the cultural imagination. Writers and moralists used executions as cautionary tales, emphasizing the consequences of sin, crime, and defiance of authority. Philosophers reflected on the nature of justice, punishment, and human behavior, considering the balance between deterrence, retribution, and mercy. These intellectual and cultural reflections contributed to the long-term understanding of justice, ethics, and governance. Religious institutions continued to integrate lessons from executions into their teachings. Sermons, confessions, and moral instruction frequently referenced historical punishments, emphasizing the spiritual consequences of sin. Martyrs, heretics, and the executed became examples of virtue or vice, reinforcing spiritual narratives that shaped individual and communal morality. In this sense, public executions transcended their immediate civic purpose, becoming vehicles for spiritual education and reflection on the nature of good and evil. The spectacle of execution also contributed to the evolution of legal and penal systems. Observing the social, moral, and psychological impact of public punishment, authorities recognized both its effectiveness and its limits. While executions deterred some crimes, excessive brutality could provoke fear, unrest, or sympathy for the condemned. Over time, societies began to consider the balance between public deterrence and private justice, influencing the development of prison systems, penitentiaries, and codified legal procedures. The legacy of public execution, therefore, is embedded in both cultural memory and the evolution of law itself. Public executions also reinforced communal identity and social cohesion. Witnessing crime and punishment together, communities affirmed shared values and expectations. These events created a collective narrative of right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, obedience and transgression. The presence of authorities, clergy, and the public transformed justice into a communal experience, embedding lessons about social norms, hierarchy, and morality into the fabric of everyday life. The memory of these events contributed to a cultural understanding of collective responsibility and civic participation, even as the methods of punishment evolved. The cultural imprint of medieval public executions persisted. Literature, art, folklore, and popular imagination retained echoes of the scaffold, gallows, and stake. Historical novels, plays, and films drew inspiration from these dramatic events, emphasizing both human courage and cruelty. Stories of executed criminals, witches, heretics, and rebels informed moral narratives, entertainment, and education alike. The psychological and emotional resonance of public punishment ensured that its lessons were not forgotten. Even as societal practices shifted, the ethical reflections prompted by public executions influenced philosophical thought. Debates about justice, proportionality, cruelty, and the rights of individuals emerged as societies grappled with the moral implications of state-sanctioned killing. Scholars and thinkers considered the tension between deterrence and mercy, punishment and rehabilitation, fear, and fairness. These considerations contributed to the gradual transformation of legal and penal systems, shaping modern ideas about human rights, criminal responsibility, and the role of the state in administering justice. Despite their harshness, executions also illuminated human resilience, courage, and morality. Witness accounts often highlighted the bravery of the condemned, their expressions of repentance, defiance, or spiritual faith. Clergy and officials demonstrated moral responsibility, seeking to ensure that justice was carried out with a sense of ritual, procedure, and ethical consideration. Spectators absorbed lessons not only about the consequences of crime, but also about virtue, courage, and communal values. Public executions thus left a nuanced legacy, reflecting both human cruelty and humanity's capacity for moral reflection in contemporary times. The memory of medieval executions serves as a window into the past, offering insight into societal structures, beliefs, and moral frameworks. Museums, documentaries, historical reenactments, and academic studies preserve and interpret the events, providing both education and reflection. The narratives of crime and punishment invite contemplation about justice, morality, and social cohesion, connecting modern audiences to the fears, values, and ethics of medieval communities. Though the methods of enforcement have evolved, the human fascination with crime, consequence, and communal observation endures. The legacy of public executions also challenges modern audiences to consider the role of justice in society. By reflecting on historical practices, one can examine the balance between deterrence, morality, and human rights. Medieval executions, with their spectacle, social participation, and moral undertones, demonstrate the complexity of enforcing law while shaping culture. They remind us that justice is not merely a system of rules, but a deeply human enterprise, entwined with fear, fascination, and collective conscience. Finally, public executions remind us that history is both instructive and immersive. By examining the sights, sounds, and stories of these events, we gain insight into the lives, beliefs, and social norms of the past. The scaffold, gallows, and stake were more than instruments of punishment. They were stages upon which human behavior, societal values, and moral lessons played out. From the individual condemned to the observing crowd, from the executioner to the clergy, every participant contributed to a living, breathing narrative of crime, punishment, and morality. As we close this journey through the history of public executions in the Middle Ages, we are reminded that these acts, while grim, were central to the shaping of medieval society. They educated, terrified, and unified communities, leaving a lasting imprint on culture, memory, and moral reflection. Their legacy endures in the stories we tell, the art we preserve, and the lessons we continue to draw from a world where justice was public, visceral, and unforgettable.